Right now, you're probably on one of two paths. On path number one, you're really unsure. You're unsure of what food to eat, what not to eat, how much to eat, how to train, what not to train, what's too much, what's too little. All of it's confusing. You are stuck in this cycle of trying to make health progress and then getting derailed and then trying again and then getting derailed. And you just keep starting and stopping and starting and stopping, whether it's every 6 weeks or every 6 months or every year, that you're just trapped in this cycle on and off again. You get overwhelmed by this feeling of shame because it feels like it's all your fault. You should be able to pray yourself there, will yourself there, or have more willpower or discipline or something. But like you continue to fail yourself. Meanwhile, you continue to separate your faith from your health as if the two of them aren't in any way related. And then you're looking for validation in the scale to move, or your clothes to fit better, your energy to improve, or your body to feel better. Meanwhile, you continue to disappoint yourself. This course is for you. This is to get you from path one to path number two. In path number two, you understand food, what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat. You understand training and what to do. You know that health is an overflow of faithfulness, not something to be driven by fear. And you feel freedom in making choices on a day-to-day basis, when you go on vacation, when you're having a hard week, when you're having a good celebratory week. You feel freedom in all those choices, and you feel confident in walking day to day because you understand that, again, that health is an overflow of faithfulness. All right. If you are on path two, this course is also for you to continue to encourage you to walk in this way. See, this course is built not purely out of just like random thoughts. It's built out of years of experience, education, and everyday walk. All right. I'm Kelly Murphy. I'm a registered dietitian and a strength and conditioning coach. And I've worked with individuals from a nutrition and strength and conditioning perspective for over 10 years. I have an undergrad degree in nutritional sciences from Cornell University and a master's degree in applied exercise physiology from Columbia University. And between both of those educational stints, I became a follower of Jesus. And through my experience in working with individuals from clinical settings to athletic settings to everyday settings, I've been able to combine the science of what I've learned and my walk with Jesus and understanding of his word to help better educate individuals on what it means to actually steward your body well. All right. How do we actually live as Christian women in this world and steward our bodies faithfully? What does that actually look like? This course is for that, right? So in this, I'm going to go through a number of things. First, we're going to start off with the theology of the body. What does God actually say about our bodies? What does scripture teach us about it? And how should we be looking at our bodies from a biblical perspective? Then we're going to go into nutrition. What is the basis of nutrition that I need to understand? How does food work within my body? What does it actually do? Why do I actually need it? Then we're going to go into training. All right. What does working out actually look like? What is the reason for it? Why do I need to do it? How does that change my body physiologically? And what should I actually be doing? And then in part number four is the most important part for individuals on path number one to get to path number two. And here's why, because it takes the understanding of parts 1, 2, and 3. What does God say about our bodies? What do we know about nutrition? And what do we know about training? And it gives us a practical application of how to turn those thoughts into actions. This is when we focus on mindset, because how our minds are towards these three things will help us take the knowledge and turn it into action. And then part number 5, we're going to go over some of the extra things that actually impact our health on a day-to-day basis that are outside of those boundaries of nutrition and training, but still affect our physiology. So come along with me and let's learn together what God actually says about our bodies, because it's important and it matters. So let's steward them faithfully. Hey, and welcome to part 1 of this course. I'm really excited to get started. Today, we're going to talk all about theology of the body. So before we talk about nutrition or training or discipline or health or habits or any of that, I think we need to start with a much more basic and foundational question. And that is, what does God say about the body? Like our physical structure body. Like not what does diet culture, fitness culture, wellness culture, mom, dad, like even Christian productivity culture. Like what does God say about our body? Because I think if we don't get that right, then everything downstream, nutrition, training, health, discipline, all becomes something that it's not. Becomes fear, control, idolatry, or something else, right? John Piper says the body is not a mere shell that we can slough off. It's part of God's good creation. I think that one statement would challenge a lot of us already, because like, when was the last time you thought about your body as being something that is good? I think oftentimes we're taught either implicitly or explicitly that our body is something to indulge or to fix or to control or to optimize. But I think scripture says something different, right? Did you realize that our bodies are the only thing in God's creation that he promises to raise and redeem into eternity? Like, think about that for a second. The only thing he's going to raise and redeem into eternity. That's wild. And I think that points directly to its importance. So we're going to start off at the beginning, right? Because I think that's a good place to start, always at the beginning. Because we learn in the beginning that the body is actually God's idea. All right. So read with me here in Genesis 1:26-31. I'm going to read it off my screen. Read along with me. And here's the deal. When I'm reading it, there are 4 main things I'm going to be presenting afterwards. So try to listen for those 4 main things that God actually says in this passage. So then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. The image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruits. You shall have them for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. So we read at the beginning here that we were created in God's image. And this is not an abstract concept. It's also like not necessarily meaning like we don't have the same number of arms and legs and eye color and all the same physical attributes as God. It means that our whole selves, like our body and our soul, were created to reflect God relationally, to share in his authority over creation, and are made for communion with him, right? We are, therefore, embodied persons. Embodied meaning like to contain or to be part of, right? Embodied persons, body and soul. That is embodied, right? So, like I said, there are 4 essential things that we read in this passage. So let's go over these 4 things. So, first thing is we read, let us make man in our image. So that shows us that we were created on purpose to reflect God, right? And this reflection includes the body. He goes on to say, or we go on to read, right? Have dominion. So our bodies were created with a functional purpose. So dominion doesn't necessarily mean like domination. I'm dominating the earth, right? Dominion means like a responsibility. And like beyond that, like responsible stewardship, meaning like to govern with authority, like to care for creation and to cultivate it so that it can flourish, right? We have responsible stewardship over the creation of the earth, right? And bodies are required to carry out God's work in the world. Like we're required, like they're needed for that work. Through this statement, we read that, right? And also we read that like with them, we can participate in communion with God as we steward his creation, right? In communion with God. So we were made in his image, right? On purpose. We have a functional purpose. And then it says also be fruitful and multiply. So what does that actually mean? It means have babies and fill the earth, right? Have little God glorifying babies, like little worshipers all over the earth, fill them. That shows importance and value of the bodies, like in general with that statement, because that means that God's purposes are going to move forward through embodied life. Like to have babies means to physically reproduce and to be able to like have these embodied persons throughout the world. Like that shows the value of that. And the 4th thing that we read here in this passage is, and behold, it was very good, right? So not just souls, not just intentions, not just thoughts, like whatever. Like it was very good, meaning that our bodies are included. Everything he created was very good. All right, bodies included. We further read in Genesis 2:7, then the Lord formed man from dust, from the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. All right, so God intentionally breathed life into Adam. Like he could have created invisible souls floating around the earth or floating wherever, right? But he didn't. He intentionally created Adam and he breathed life into him. He created a physical being and breathed life into him, right? He made a man and a soul with a physical body. All right. Where this is also reiterated a little bit in Psalm 139, which is one of those verses you see on like coffee cups all the time. It's like, it's kind of annoying, you know, like I don't love that all the time. That has nothing to do with anything, but you might have read it on a coffee mug. Most people are familiar with this, but let's go ahead and read it in Psalm 139, 13-16. It reads, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. So, in the beginning we read that you knitted me together. Okay, God knits us together. I think this is a very intentional word. Like, think about it. Knitting is a very slow, attentive, intentional process, right? God intentionally knitted you together. He intentionally created you. And I think that that is pretty amazing when we think about that, right? God is very intentional. And like we see in all of this, that he was intentional with creating us physically, right? In embodied form, soul with a body, all right? Next, like as we think about like, all right, so we were created on purpose. We have a purpose. Great. So like, what is the actual like purpose then of a body? I think that's a natural next question. So let's kind of go into that, right? If we were created on purpose, what is the purpose of all this? So we're going to read in Genesis 2:15. It says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. All right. This shows that our bodies have a functional purpose as well, right? They're created on purpose and they have a functional purpose. So there are physical responsibilities that are shown right here, right? To cultivate, to create, to serve, to love, to govern creation in a way that makes God's glory visible, right? That is part of a functional purpose of our bodies here, right? This is going to reiterate what was said in Genesis 1:28 when we read like, have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over all the living things that move on the earth, right? Have dominion over, have responsible stewardship over. This is another form of that, right? There was a responsibility that was given to man, a physical responsibility that was given to man in addition to that is repeated from Genesis 1:28, right? John Piper describes dominion as a way of making God's worth visible, right? So we see that with these responsibilities. It's a way of making God's worth visible, all right? The body exists, and this shows us, it exists to participate in God's creative and relational work here. The physical body is made to participate in God's work on this earth, right? Our body is not something that we merely just have. It is something that we use in love in order to point to and to glorify God, right? It's not just something to have. There is a purpose behind it as well, right? All of this is great, right? We were created on purpose. Our bodies have a purpose, right? The problem is that Genesis 3 happened. So that changed everything. So let's go on to that and what actually changed from there. So like I said, in Genesis 3, the fall changed everything. So I'm going to start off by reading Genesis 3:16-19. So go ahead and read along with me. It says, to the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the fields. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. All right, we see at this point that work now becomes hard, toilsome, laborious, right? We see that childbearing becomes painful at this point. Bodies are going to begin to decay at this point as well. And when we read this last sentence, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. That shows us also that now provision is going to require effort and frustration as opposed to just trust-filled dependence on God. And that is honestly really frustrating. But we see that happen here. Not only that, and we also see this is where shame enters in, right? This is where shame enters, is after the fall. So if we go back before the fall, we see in Genesis 2:25, it says, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed, right? There was no shame. Then in Genesis 3:7, we read, so this is post-fall, then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and they made themselves loincloths. So at this point, post-fall, we see that like awareness becomes anxiety, right? Visibility became vulnerability at this point. And this is where humans began to be like, there was a distorted view or distorted relationship that humans had with their bodies at this point. Our bodies at the point of the fall, because of the fall, became something that we now manage as opposed to just inhabit. We see this like idea further reiterated in Romans 8:20-23, right? So it starts off by saying, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. So in that first sentence, we see for the creation was subjected to futility. So this is as a result of the fall. We are now subjected to futility, meaning frustration, corruption, limitations, like our bodies not necessarily working the way that they were intended to, right? Then, though, if we fast forward to that last sentence, we actually see that there is hope, right? Wait eagerly for adoptions as sons, the redemption of our bodies. So this leads to hope. So, right, our bodies were created on purpose. They have a functional purpose. The fall distorted things, right? It distorted our relationship with our bodies. It distorted how we think about them and how we relate to them, right? But there is redemption. So let's go into redemption, right? That is the next part of it. There is redemption. So here's the thing. Everyone, when we read John 1:14, it should stop every one of us because it is a wild statement, right? The word became flesh. That should stop you dead in your tracks if you really think about it. The word became flesh. Okay, that shows us God did not just redeem us away from our bodies. He redeemed us through one. Like Jesus had a body. God thought it was so important that Jesus have a fully physically embodied life here on earth. He didn't just send his spirit, right? He sent him in a full physically embodied form to life, to live and die and be resurrected. Like, think about that. That shows us how much value that God puts on our bodies. All right. In 1 Corinthians 6:19-20, it also reads, or do you not know that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you are bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. So this is not a threat. This is a declaration of value if we're reading this, right? Before, our bodies were in a tabernacle, like a physical tabernacle, right? Now, as believers of Jesus Christ, like if you fully accept the gospel, you surrender to him, you're a believer of Jesus, you seek to pursue him and surrender your life to him fully, right? He now lives, like his spirit now lives in you, right? Like that is crazy. And that's like really like mind blowing if we really like think about it. But like that can't be taken lightly. Like if we think about it, like he lives in you. Like there are so many people who care a lot about so many things in life and like specific like rooms, like in their house, right? Specifically, if you think about your bedroom, like so many people are very cautious as to like where each thing goes and where they place things and who has access to it and whether or not it's clean. Hopefully you clean it, you know, like there are certain things that because that is your sacred place, right? there's a degree of care that you take because of that space. Like, how much more would you consider if your body, like your embodied form, houses the Holy Spirit? Like, how much more would you think about that? Like, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God is in you. Like, and again, I know that's an abstract thought, but like the weight of it, like, can't be breezed by. That is wild. All right. Not only that, but in the end of this verse, it says, so glorify God in your body. Like, that is a command to glorify God in your body, right? Further in 1 Corinthians, it reiterates the fact that like redemption is not an escape from our body, right? Is a restoration of it. So read with me in 1 Corinthians 15:42-44. It says, so is it with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown in natural body. It is raised in spiritual body. If there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. All right. Our bodies will be raised. They're not going to be replaced. Like, God doesn't wipe this one out and give you a new one. Like, he's going to replace it. He's going to restore it. All right. Our body has eternal significance. Think about this is like, what is perishable is not going to be imperishable. What is weak is not going to be power. Like, our bodies have a eternal importance. They matter eternally. And I think that is awesome. Like, that is the redemptive aspect of it. Like, our bodies were made on purpose. They have a functional purpose. Yes, the fall distorted everything, but there is redemption, right? There is ultimate restoration in eternity, and that is amazing. It also shows value that stretches from the beginning all the way through eternity. All right, so as we talk about all of these things, how do we actually, like, how does this fit in my day-to-day life, right? I think that's an easy next step of like, great, all right, cool. But like, what does this actually look like? So I'm going to go over 5 ways that we actually relate to our body. All right. 5 ways that we relate to our body. And this is where the intersection of health and beauty and truth, they all kind of start to come together. All right. And so as we begin, I think the first thing that's going to be really important is that we start to talk about or define what is health and what is beauty. So as we start to think about this, we can kind of understand the language that I'm talking about, right? So health is defined as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. All right. That is what health is. Beauty is a little bit more complicated than that. So beauty is defined as the quality of group of qualities in a person or thing that gives pleasure to the senses or the mind. I think we oftentimes just think of beauty as like physical attractiveness. Like, beauty is far more than just physical attractiveness. It is a quality or group of qualities that like gives pleasure to the senses and to the mind. All right. That is what we're talking about. So when we're talking about the 5 ways that we can relate to our body, first way we're going to go over is what's called indulgence, right? Or the body as ultimate pleasure. In this way of relating to our bodies, right, health becomes reactive because all of the things like nutrition and training and disciplines all become disciplines. They all become efforts of soothing discomfort, right? And so that's what the ultimate goal is with those efforts. We also see beauty as something to consume, whether it's to consume for validation or stimulation or attention, right? Scripture actually calls this gluttony. And that has nothing to do with size, right? I think there can be correlations with physical size of your body, but it's not like a direct, like this causes size. That's not gluttony. Gluttony has to do with governance, right? And so when your body begins to rule you, that's when you lose power, or that's where you lose freedom, right? Not power, right? That like body ruling us is going to take away our freedom. All right. The second way that we relate to our bodies is fixation, right? So the body as a means of worth or for worth, right? And so here we see that health becomes proof of discipline, of goodness, of control, of doing the right thing, right? And beauty at this point becomes justification, right? You're fixed on it. You're justifying your worth through it. And at this point also, like, your body starts to take on a weight that it was never intended to carry, and that is becoming your identity. And the problem with this also is that when your body starts to change, and it will, because our bodies change, right? Our worth begins to collapse. And that's where we see an issue here with this fixation, right? Our third way of being able to relate to our bodies is control, or the body for ultimate safety. All right, so when you start to think about this, health becomes insurance. So if you're eating right, if you're exercising, taking the right supplements, doing all the right things, right? Like nothing bad can happen to you. Like you're safe, right? And beauty becomes management. Like vulnerability is minimized, right? You're just managing your beauty. And this may look responsible, but underneath it, it's all driven by fear. So this is just a result of fear. All right. The fourth way that we can relate to our body is worship. And so this is giving body ultimate meaning. All right. So from this, health becomes salvation. And life is all about preservation of the body, an obsession with longevity, doing all the things to make it last as long as possible and like saving the body. All right. Then beauty promises transcendence. And the problem is when all this happens, this is when the body becomes a form of idolatry. Like this thing that was good has now become your God, something that you're looking to and worshiping for ultimate meaning. And that was never what it was intended to be. All right. And then the fifth way that we can relate to our bodies is called stewardship, right? And this is the body as a gift and responsibility. So in this form of relationship, right, with our bodies, health is now a byproduct and not a goal. It is a byproduct and not a goal. All right. Beauty becomes participatory and not comparative because it is now defined by the incarnation, right? Jesus is love. And so beauty is now love made visible. So instead of saying, how do I feel or how do I look? It is now, how do I love others well? How do I serve well? What enables me to be faithful? Those are the questions that we begin to ask because our bodies become radiant through love, through discipline, and through surrender. That is when we start to, that is what it becomes, right? So why does this all matter, right? Because at the end of the day, health can be a sin, neglect can be a sin, obsession can be a sin. And the issue is not, like your body is not bad. Like it was not made bad. The issue is not necessarily your body. It's what we believe it is for, right? And so stewardship requires dependency. It requires restraint. It requires humility. And that is what can lead to freedom, right? Because at this point also, when we get to that point of stewardship, right, we're now able to see health and beauty as agents of love, as opposed to meaning, safety, salvation, or worth, right? They are now agents of love. And from there, that's where nutrition, training, discipline can all finally make sense. Hey, welcome to part 2 of this course. I'm really excited to get started. Today, we're going to talk all about nutrition. So last time in part 1, we dug into what does God actually say about our bodies. Now today, we're going to explore how do our bodies actually function and how does food fit into that equation. In part 1, we talked about faithful stewardship, and that was seeing our bodies as both a gift and a responsibility in which we can participate with God in making His glory visible here on earth. I believe that as we explore more about how and learn how our bodies function, what does food do and how can our body use it to do specific things that it was intended to do, I think that helps us more easily make wise choices. It helps us steward our bodies better based on that understanding. So let's get started. First, we're going to go over some definitions we talked about last time and we'll talk about today and add on to it just so that we're starting on the same page, right? And so first, let's review what health is. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. All right. So it's not just the absence of disease. It's not just about your weight. It actually includes a lot of other things: energy, mood, strength, recovery, longevity. All these things are incorporated or included in health, in being a healthy being. All right. Nutrition, on the other hand, is related to that in that nutrition is the process by which living organisms, human beings, right, obtain and use food to support growth, energy production, repair, and overall function. I think it's really easy for us to think about food. Food is fuel. Like, yes, food does help provide us with energy, but that's not the only thing, right? We have so many different systems in our bodies, from our muscular system, our immune system, our cardiovascular system, and so many more. And each of them require different nutrients or different components of our food in order to function a specific way. And so nutrition is the whole process of using food to do all the different things in our body that it was designed to do. So like, why is this important? Why do we need to talk about it's because there's so much confusion when it comes to nutrition. There's so much confusion over what actually happens in our bodies, what foods we need, how much we need, all of that stuff. And that's really hard. Where's it coming from? People are giving individual anecdotes. This happened for me, so you have to do this. And it gets confusing. Like, well, should I do that? And then there are all the trends. Like, do I hop on this trend? There's all the fear of like, hey, one day bananas are good, the next day they're bad. One day spinach is good, and then the next day it's going to cause kidney stones. Like, is this true? Is it not true? Like, I don't actually know what to believe. And so that's really hard. And a lot of it, there's like a lack of understanding in the big picture when all these little anecdotes are kind of like thrown out into the media. Like, marketing does a really good job of hooking you in and giving you enough information that it sounds reasonable, but not necessarily the big picture to fully understand. Is this true? Is this not true? So my goal for today is not to provide you with a diet or anything like that. My goal for today is to help you understand what is in food. How does our body use those different components of food to do what it's intended to do, to fulfill its design? And then also, is there a framework I can follow on a day-to-day basis so that I can best steward my body? That's the goal for today. I want to clarify things so that moving forward, you have a degree of understanding and you have an action plan moving forward. All right, so let's get started with going over some things like digestion and metabolism. So that's all involved in food, right? We talk about digestion all the time. So what is digestion? It's actually the process of mechanically and chemically breaking down food into smaller bits so that they can be absorbed and used in our body, right? Absorbed into our bloodstream, spread throughout our body so that it can be used for the intended function. So digestion actually starts in our mouth with chewing, and that's important, right? You're not going to just like take a large bite of bread and swallow it whole. Like, you need to actually break it into pieces so that as it goes down our digestive system, we have different chemicals that can interact with it to break it down further and then allow our body to absorb it and then spread it throughout our body. All right. That is what digestion is. Metabolism, on the other hand, is using those nutrients for their intended function in our body. I think oftentimes it's really easy to simplify metabolism and just think about our body's ability to like use energy, but that's not all that metabolism is, right? Metabolism is a collection of life-sustaining chemical reactions. It is a system. It is not one thing. So it involves converting food into energy, which is part of it, but not the whole thing. It's involved in, like, it includes building and repairing tissue, eliminating waste, maintaining internal balance. So maintaining internal balance is like, we have fluid balances throughout our body, like in our cells and outside of our cells. We also have pH or acidity levels that are very specific. So they're very specific environments that are within our body, like very specific. And so small shifts in and out can actually dramatically affect our overall health or our overall well-being. And so as we eat food, our body has a process of regulating that balance to sustain life so that those shifts don't shift too much. All right. Let's start off with the basics of energy, because everyone always asks me about calories. What about calories? So let's talk about it. All right. So when we're talking about energy in our food, it is not the end all be all. We talked about how metabolism involves a bunch of different functions within our bodies, right? Energy is part of it, right? If we don't have enough energy, we will die. So we need energy. So how does our body use energy? What is energy in food? Energy in food is quantified as calories, right? And like, if we're going to get super picky, like a calorie, so calorie and kilocalorie is like used interchangeably. Technically a kilocalorie is 1 calorie. Like, that's how we call it. That's what it is in food. Technically it's a kilocalorie. We just call it a calorie. Anyways, so I'm going to use both of those. But a calorie in food is technically the amount of heat that's required to take 1 milliliter of water and raise it by 1 degree Celsius. What does that mean? It's a measurement of energy, right? So a calorie is a measurement of energy within our food, and how we measure energy with it's energy within our food, right? So it is not good. It is not bad. It is a very neutral, just like measurement. That's all that it is. And when we think about it, our body needs an energy balance, just like it needs a balance of every other thing, right? And so, like, very simplistically, when we think about how much energy our body needs, if you consume more energy than you expend, you will gain weight. If you consume less energy than you expend, you will lose weight. If you consume the same amount that you expend, you'll maintain weight. I say that with an asterisk, in that our body adapts to major shifts over time. So our metabolism, or our ability to use food as energy, can adjust based on like long periods of like underconsumption of energy or overconsumption. So our body's biggest internal goal is to maintain life. It's to not die. That is the biggest goal of it, right? And so it's constantly seeking a homeostasis. It's constantly seeking a place where it's status quo. Nothing changes so that there are not large shifts. So if there are big variations in consumption, it is actually going to try to adjust to minimize so that those big shifts don't affect the overall being. All right. So our metabolism or our ability to use food for energy and also all the other functions can adjust based on dramatic shifts. All right. So that equation of like calorie in versus calorie out, I say with a degree of like with an asterisk because it's not the big picture. All right. Food quality also affects how we metabolize things, how we use food for the intended purpose, energy and all the other functions, right? Because why? Because food quality is going to affect hunger. It can affect hormones. It can affect muscle retention. It can affect blood sugar stability. It can affect nutrient sufficiency. And if any of those are adjusted, it's going to affect the overall system, right? Our metabolism, the function within our body, it's all one system. A system is going to be affected and it can adjust that. And typically it's going to negatively adjust the system if any of those things are off, right? Calories matter, but they're not the whole picture. All right. So I always give the analogy of like Swedish fish and chicken. If I said, hey, for 1 week, you can either have 1 plate of grilled chicken for every meal or 1 plate of Swedish fish for every meal. I think although we know that it's not like they're not a ton of, we all know that our body's going to react different on both of those things, right? Even if calorically the same, right? There may not be a variation. There's not a fruit or a vegetable or any of that stuff, whatever. But if you just had those, you were going to have dramatic changes in your body, this compared to this one. All right. So calories are one aspect of food. Energy is one aspect of food, but is not the end all be all when it comes to overall health. All right. To give you perspective, just for measurement quantities, right? When we're talking about fat, so 1 pound of fat is estimated to be about 3,500 calories. And I say this because I think oftentimes I get questions about calories and I hear people be like, hey, someone's saying something about a 500 calorie deficit or 500 calories. Why do people always talk about 500 calories? The reason they do that is typically if someone is adjusting or is attempting to lose body fat for whatever reason, they will typically talk about a 500 calorie deficit per day. Why? Because 500 calories times 7 days is going to be about 3,500 calories, right? Which is about 1 pound. So that deficit should, in theory, in general, equate to about a 1 pound weight loss per week. So you'll typically hear that in the media. People will talk about a 500 calorie deficit. I'm not suggesting that you do that. I'm just giving you that information to give you perspective and understanding of why you would have heard that in the first place. All right. All right, let's talk about how we actually use energy. How does our body burn calories? How do we use energy on a day-to-day basis? So there are 4 main ways that our body actually uses energy. So the first one is going to be what's called BMR, or your basal metabolic rate. That's a very fancy way of saying like staying alive. Like in order for your vital organs, in order for your body to function, just being alive, not even to move, just to be, that's going to cost you about 60 to 70% of your total estimated amount of calories for the day. All right. So about 60 to 70% of the amount of energy that you expend in a total day is going to come from just being alive. All right. The second way that we burn calories or we use energy is NEAT. All right. That stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis, a fancy way of saying all the small movements that are not exercise. So fidgeting, walking, shivering, all the other like twitches you would do, blinking, all the movements you have that are not necessarily exercise, all right, that is considered NEAT. That's about 15 to 30% of the total calories you're going to expend in a day. And it's going to be different depending on like how naturally active or like twitchy, honestly, you are as a human being, right? If you're someone who fidgets all the time, you're someone who has a mobile job where you're walking a lot, that is movement, but it's not necessarily like exercise. So it's all that additional energy that you're expending in a day, right? Thermic effect of food is the third way that we burn calories or expend energy in a day. And that's typically relative to the food item that you're consuming. So about 10% of the calories or the total energy in the food that you're you're consuming is used to break it down and use it for whatever the intended purpose is within your body. All right. Because breaking down food for energy actually costs energy to do that. And so that's about 10% of it. I will say protein has the highest thermic effect of food, so the highest cost, but on average, it's about 10% of the total calories in that food item. All right. Although there is a little bit of variation there. And then exercise is the fourth way. And obviously that's going to be very dependent on from person to person, how much exercise. And exercise is like intentional training that you're doing. Most of the time I find that people assume that they're doing like that there's a lot more energy expended in exercise than there really is. But when we're talking about overall ways that we burn calories or we use energy in a day, these are the four main ways that we do it, right? I will say this, that how many calories you need in a total day is going to be dependent on these things, but it's also going to be dependent on your height, your weight, your age, your activity level, your body composition, your medical conditions. All of those can affect how many calories are required to sustain your body in a typical day. And so just gives you an overall idea of like what energy looks like and the energy needs that you might have in a day. All right. So let's move on to what's actually in food. So what food actually provides us with energy? So we're going to start with macros. Why? Because macronutrients are the parts of our food that actually contain energy. So let's talk about it. We have macronutrients, we have micronutrients. Most people have heard of macros. Macros is short for macronutrient. It is trendy to count macros and everything. When I ask people when they talk about macros, what are macros? About 50-50. It's about a 50-50 response. 50% understand what they're talking about 50% just know the term. All right. So let's define it so everybody knows. Macronutrients are nutrients within our food that are measured in larger amounts. All right. So it's our carbs, fat, and our protein. Micronutrients, on the other hand, are different. They're measured in smaller amounts. So our macronutrients are measured in grams. Micronutrients are like milligrams, micrograms, nanograms, all that smaller amounts, right? Macronutrients have energy, all right? Direct energy. They have calories. Micronutrients do not have any calories associated with them. All right. So let's talk about macronutrients, carbs, fat, protein. I do say here, alcohol also has calories. It is not a macronutrient, but I put that in there just so that people are aware that it does. We're not going to dig into it at all, but just for reference there. Carbs, fat, and protein, they all have energy. So to give you an idea of relative density of these molecules, right? So carbohydrates and protein have 4 calories per gram. Fat has 9. All right. That has to do, so when we get into different like food items, we can talk about the density of it, but that just gives you relative perspective. So let's talk about carbohydrates to start off with. Everyone talks about carbs all the time. I'm going to use carbohydrate and carbs interchangeably. They mean the same thing. All right. When we're talking about carbohydrates, the primary function of carbs is to give us quick energy. All right. They break down really fast into energy. So as we saw in the digestion part of this, carbohydrates break down into glucose in our blood. Glucose is then broken down and produces ATP, which is a measurement of energy within our body. All right. So those are carbohydrates. That is the main function. When we talk about carbohydrates, there are different types of them. So a lot of times people will talk about like sugars or carbs. Carbohydrates are made up of sugars. All right. So there are different types of sugars. So there are 3 main basic sugars: glucose, fructose, and galactose. All right. That's the sciences I'm going to get here. But when we think about it, all of the different carbohydrates are made up of one of those 3 simple sugar molecules. All right. They have to do with, they're either those or those bound to themselves or another one of those. All right. So we have our simple sugars. Those 3 molecules are single sugar units. They don't have to be broken down. They just like, right. Those are simplified. And they're used for quick energy, right? They're known as quick energy. Then we have 2 sugar molecules, all right, where 2 of those are bound together. Those are also broken down, so digested and absorbed and used very quickly, all right? So those are known as simple sugars, all right? Then we have complex carbohydrates. Now, complex carbohydrates are starches or fibers. They are still composed of our simple sugars, so glucose bound, right? They're just in a lot longer form. So starches are actually just long strings of sugars bound together. They take longer to break down and digest, so they don't create as much of a spike in your blood sugar right away. But it is a bunch of sugar that is bound together. That's what makes up a starch. All right. Fiber is a little bit different. So fiber is also a bunch of sugars bound together, but because of the way that it's bound, it's normally in like these like web, it looks, yeah, in these like web-ish type molecules. Our body doesn't necessarily digest or break it apart fully. All right. There are two main forms of fiber. There's insoluble and soluble fiber. I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds there, but there are two different kinds of them. As a whole, fiber, what is the function of it? We talk about fiber all the time. It's estimated that most adult females need about 25 grams per day. All right. So fiber is important for a couple of things. One, it's going to slow down digestion. Certain types of it can actually increase the speed of digestion, but for the most part, it slows down digestion. It improves blood sugar control. It can help to lower cholesterol levels. It can support your gut bacteria, and it can also increase your fullness. So it does all good things. All of these things are super beneficial. We want fiber. Fiber is good. It is a type of carbohydrate. It is different than the other types of carbohydrates and does not affect your blood sugar as much. And we want to get it, like I said, 25 grams per day for adult females. So what are sources of carbohydrates? So main sources of carbohydrates, fruit, any kind of fruit. And we're talking nutritional fruit. Everyone's always like, what about a tomato? Like, no, that's a nutritional non-starchy vegetable. All right. So we're talking about a fruit, bananas, apples, grapes, berries, all that stuff. That's going to be a fruit. Those are going to be high carbohydrate foods. All right. Grains. So rice, bread, pasta. Those are all high carbohydrate foods. Starchy vegetables. So potatoes, peas, corn, beans, those are all going to have carbohydrates in there. I don't have it on here also, but like dairy milk and not Greek yogurt, like regular dairy yogurt, those are also sources of carbohydrates. All right. So those are our carb-rich foods. Fiber is in a bunch of different foods as well. So fiber is going to be in our fruits. It's going to be in our starchy vegetables, in our non-starchy vegetables as well. And our whole grains. All right. Fiber, like I said, it slows down digestion. It's going to be digested differently than so those complex carbohydrates, so fiber and starch, are going to slow down digestion and they're going to take longer to break down, right? They're going to be digested slower than a more simple type of carbohydrate like white bread. All right. That's highly processed. So just for reference on there. All right, so let's move on to fats, all right? Fat, so where carbohydrate was quick energy, fat, one of the main functions of that is going to be long-term energy, all right? So yes, it is more dense, energy dense than carbohydrates. So to give you a relative idea, an apple the size of a tennis ball, it's a fruit, so it's mainly a carbohydrate source. Apple the size of a tennis ball has about 15 grams of carbohydrates in there, which is going to equate to about 60 calories, right? A golf ball sized serving of peanut butter is going to be mostly fat, and it's going to be about 180 to 200 calories because it's mostly fat. All right. So 60 versus 180, just because of the density of that molecule, in the sense of like, there's more fat in this, so it's going to be more calorically dense. There's more carbohydrate. It's not going to have quite as many. Just gives you relative energy density for those food items. All right. So moving back to fat. Fat, it is long-term energy. It is not, again, it is not good or bad. It is like we need energy. So parts of it is good, but it shouldn't, I think in the 90s, fat was deemed as bad. Just because it's more dense doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. You just have to be aware of the density of it, right? So long-term energy. I typically will also compare carbohydrates and fat used for energy as a campfire. So the hot logs at the bottom that burn but don't really go anywhere, that's like fat. The kindling on the top that goes up really fast, that's going to be like your carbohydrates, right? Quick energy versus that long-term energy. Fat, a little bit goes a long way. So it is long-term energy. All right. Not only does fat produce us with long-term energy, but also it's required for a bunch of different things. So we have what are called fat-soluble vitamins, meaning they require fat in order to be absorbed. Like vitamins A, D, E, and K require fat to be absorbed. So when you have those, it's best to have, like, I know people that have taken vitamin D supplements, it's best to have that with a meal where there's fat in it so that your body can better absorb that vitamin D. All right. Fat is also involved in hormone production, specifically our sex hormones. It's involved in brain function. About 80% of your brain is fat. So fat is involved in brain function, and it's also involved in inflammation regulation. So this kind of leads me into the different types of fats. So there are different types of fats. There are saturated, unsaturated, and then trans. We're trying to get rid of trans in most of our food systems, but let's talk about this. Saturated fat is primarily solid at room temperature. All right. So like if you, and where are you going to find this? A lot of it's going to be found in things like meats. So like if you cook ground beef and then you take it out there and then there's like the white solid stuff that's left over, that's going to be fat. That's going to be saturated fat. That's solid at room temperature. Butter, other things solid at room temperature is going to be saturated fat. All right. Saturated fat can increase inflammation. All right. Unsaturated and when consumed in excess can increase your bad cholesterol levels. All right. Unsaturated fats do the opposite, right? They're typically liquid at room temperature. So think olive oil, avocado oil, nuts, seeds. That's going to have more unsaturated fats. Those actually lower inflammation and will typically help to decrease your bad cholesterol. All right. We also have what are called essential fatty acids, essential fatty acids. So when something is deemed essential in our food system, it means our body can't make enough of it to support our health. So it needs to be consumed. So omega-3 and omega-6s are actually two examples of essential fatty acids, meaning we have to consume them in order to get adequate amounts to support health, to support our overall well-being. All right. And again, unsaturated liquid at room temperature, saturated solid at room temperature. Our trans fat is going to be primarily those that are like hydrogenated. So trans is essentially a type of fat that naturally is unsaturated and we've made it saturated. And typically this is done in food, in like packaged foods, highly processed foods, because it leads to more like a longer shelf life. And so if you put it in foods, they don't spoil as fast. The problem is that this chemical alteration on this type of fat actually will increase your bad cholesterol and decrease your good cholesterol. So we don't want that. So if you see things that say like hydrogenated oils or partially hydrogenated oils, we don't want that. That's going to be a trans fat and that's should be avoided. All right. Like I already talked about some sources of fats. We talked about olives, olive oil, nuts, seeds, right? That's going to, and avocados, those are going to be our unsaturated versus our animal fats like cheese, meats. Those are going to have more saturated fats in them. And then coconut is actually one of the few plant sources that are going to have saturated fats. All right. So let's move on to protein. So protein's all the rage right now. It's having a minute. So let's talk about it. Protein is primarily a structural nutrient. All right. It is on the outside of all of our cells. There's actually some fat on the outside of our cells as well, but it is on the outside of all of our cells. So we know it for being involved in like muscle development, but it's also involved in connective tissue development. So that's like our ligaments and our tendons, cartilage, right? Skin, enzymes, hormones, immune cells. So it's involved in a lot of different systems. So fun fact, like when you are sick, your protein needs actually increase. All right. It's highly involved in our immune system. So there's so many different functions. And again, we talk about it a lot for our muscles. And yes, protein is important for muscle development and muscle growth and muscle maintenance, but there's so many other components of it. There's so many other like needs. We have so many other needs in our body for protein other than just being part of our muscles. And I think seeing all the different things that protein is required for is really helpful in understanding that it is more than just that. All right. Protein is helpful because it's highly satiating. So protein, fat, and fiber all make you fuller. All right. Quick carbohydrates. So our simple carbohydrates, those we burn really fast. Protein, fat, fiber take longer to digest, longer to break down and actually like break down and absorb. All right. And so they actually keep you fuller a little bit longer. There are different types of proteins. All right. So we have our complete versus our incomplete. Complete proteins are typically our animal-based sources. All right. So here's the difference between complete and incomplete. So we talked about when we digest proteins, we break it down into amino acids, right? So carbohydrates break down into glucose, fats break down into fatty acids, proteins break down into amino acids, and we use that for all the intended functions of protein within our body. Okay, there are 20 different amino acids. There are 9 of them that are called essential. So like we learned in fats, if it is essential, that means we need to eat it because our body can't synthesize enough in order to be able to meet our health needs, right? So we have our complete proteins. They have all of the essential amino acids, all of the building blocks that are required to make a full protein. Like if we think about them as little Legos, like we need 20, like we need those 9 to fill in that whole Lego brick, to use it to build the house, to use it for protein, whatever its intended purpose is within our body, right? If we're missing at least one of the 9 essential amino acids, it is called an incomplete protein. All right. And so most of our plant-based sources are going to be incomplete. So they don't have all of the essential amino acids. Therefore, their protein is incomplete and cannot be fully used for their intended purpose. How do we solve this issue? It's what's called complementary amino acids. So oftentimes you'll see things like beans and rice. Why? Beans, do they have protein in them? They do, but they don't have all the essential amino acids. But rice has the ones that black, like if we're talking black beans, right? Rice has the ones that black beans or whatever beans you have. Grains complement beans. Therefore, when you have them together, it completes that full building, that full brick that you can use to build protein wherever you need to build it, right? So our incomplete requires a complement, the complementary amino acids, to be able to use that protein fully for the intended purpose in our body, all right? A lot of times I hear people being like, oh, I found this plant-based protein something, it should be better for me. No, all right? It probably has a less than ideal form of protein. Animal-based proteins are going to be complete. Our body can break them down. They can digest it and metabolize it better, break it down and use it better than something that is going to have a less than ideal form of protein. All right? So those are different types of protein. All right, let's go into micronutrients. So those are our macronutrients, carbs, fat, protein. Now we're going to talk about micronutrients. So micronutrients are helpful because they help our body use macronutrients for their intended function within our body. So if we're going to talk specifically about the definition, so micronutrients are vitamins and minerals required in small amounts for proper physiological function. Okay, so like I said, they help us use macronutrients for what they're supposed to do in our body. They, in and of themselves, don't provide energy. They drive the reactions that help our body turn carbs into energy, turn fat into energy. Protein actually can be an energy source as well. We just only use that in very extreme situations. All right. They drive reactions all throughout our body. So for example, iron and B vitamins, they help with oxygen transport in our body. Calcium helps with bone density. Most people know that. Vitamin D helps with our bone health and also with our immune support. Magnesium is involved in muscles and nerves function, muscle and nerve function, right? They're all our micronutrients. They help with a whole lot of different things. Sodium and potassium, those are 2 of our electrolytes, which are also micronutrients. They help with fluid shifting throughout our body. So our micronutrients are super important. We cannot just eat our macros, right? Oftentimes people are like carbs, fat, protein. That's all I need to think about. Calories, carbs, fat, protein. No, we got to think about micronutrients too. Why? Because they're super important for our body to be able to function the way that it needs to function. I like to talk about it like a bike. All right. So everyone's seen a bike, ridden on a bike. So you've got the framework. All right. You got the handlebars, the framework. That's like our macronutrients. You cannot go down the street if you're missing a large part of the bike, like the wheels, the handlebars, the frame. Like you can't, it's just not going to make it, right? Those are macronutrients. If we don't have energy, we're not going to function, right? But our micronutrients are like the spokes, the nuts and bolts that hold the bike together, right? We need it in order for it to make it a long period of time, in order for it to run the way that it was supposed to run. Can we get away with missing a nut or bolt here or there? Sure. All right. With whatever getting away with it is, it can still somewhat function, but is it able to go the distance it's supposed to be able to go? Can it make it on the trip that it's intended to make it? Maybe, maybe not. All right. Our deficiencies from micronutrients don't happen normally immediately. We see them accumulate over time. All right. We do have some storage mechanisms to store some of our micronutrients. So typically in our macronutrients, right? So we have storage of them. We'll look typically over about a week of intake versus like being like, yes, every day we want to be able to hit our macronutrients because that's a little bit more important. But micronutrients over the week, can we get everything that we need typically, and that will help sustain us. That is a generalization, sure, but if we're aiming for that, that's going to be a little bit more realistic because our body can store and use it at different points, right? Phytochemicals are actually a different kind of micronutrients. So they're bioactive compounds. And these are like a little bit smaller, like more minute, and that you've heard about them, right? They typically are talked about. They help with protecting cells from damage, support immune function, reduce oxidative stress. So a lot of times you'll hear like different types of specific antioxidants, whether it's like beta carotene or resveratrol, anthocyanins. Like these are smaller components that are micronutrients that are found in smaller amounts in food and are sometimes in the process of like breaking down some of our micronutrients. They're like different forms of the micronutrients essentially. And so typically we're going to see micronutrient, like we'll see them in foods. Micronutrients are in all different types of foods. All right. So all different types of food groups. We're going to see a high abundance of them in our non-starchy vegetables. So these are what are called nutrient dense. So our non-starchy vegetables are going to be anything other. So we talked about our starchies are potatoes, peas, corn, and beans. Those are going to be our starchy vegetables and winter squash. All right. Our non-starchy vegetables are going to be the other vegetables that we have. Those are called nutrient dense. We talk about fat being energy dense, high energy for the volume, right? Our non-starchy vegetables are nutrient dense, high amount of nutrients, low amount of calories or energy in those food items. All right. And so they typically are going to have fiber, which we know is not fully digested, and also high amounts of micronutrients, which is great for supporting overall health. In general, they support our overall well-being because they help us better meet our micronutrient needs. So when we're talking, our non-starchies are not the only foods though that have micronutrients. Typically different food groups are going to have different nutrients in them. So like meats are typically going to be higher in B vitamins. Dairy is going to be higher in calcium. And so there are different types of like, we see that like vitamin C is going to be high in bell peppers. So we see different types of micronutrients in different types of foods. And I will say this also, when it comes to our produce, so whether it's fruits, vegetables, starchy vegetables, color is typically associated with different nutrients. So usually when I'm talking about getting your micronutrients, I'm talking about a variation of color. I typically recommend that you try to aim for 3 different colors in a day and 5 in a week. So what does that mean? Different colors, like they're green vegetables, they're orange vegetables, they're red vegetables, they're yellow, they're white, they're purple, right? So you're aiming for different ones. So for me, like as an example, like if you have spinach mixed in your eggs, that's green. You had raspberries later with your lunch, that's red. And then at dinner, you had tomatoes, right? Well, that's another red. So let's do onions and tomatoes, right? You had some white with there. So you had white, red, and green. Great. That's 3 different colors in a day. Now, can we get 2 other ones? Can we get orange in maybe that week? Can we get maybe can you have blueberries and you're getting a blue in? So if you're really aiming for the different color variation, it's going to help you better meet your micronutrient distribution because typically colors are associated with different micronutrients. So that's when we're talking about micronutrients. All right. Let's go into hydration a little bit and touch on that because when we talk about hydration, about 50 to 70% of your body is actually made up of water. And so this variation is related to body composition. So those that have higher lean body mass are going to have a higher amount of water because muscle and lean body mass is going to retain more fluid, right? Or not retain, but include more fluid in those cells, right? So like muscle mass, you're going to be closer to 7 if you have a high muscle mass versus higher fat, less lean body or lean tissue, you're going to be closer to that 50%. Right? Because fat, bones, those have less water actually associated with them. All right. Fluid in our body is going to be both in our cells and outside of our cells as it goes. We actually lose a lot of fluid throughout the day. So a lot of times people are like, oh, I wasn't sweating. I didn't need to drink that much. Like, okay, did you talk? Did you breathe? Did you pee and poop? Like all those things are how we actually lose fluid throughout the day. And it's estimated that almost about a cup of fluid evaporates off of your skin without even sweating. So even if it's like a cold winter day, you still have evaporation that's happening off of your skin. And so you still need to make sure that you're replenishing your fluids as you go throughout the day. Mild dehydration. So even a little bit can affect your mood, your energy. It can put strain on your cardiovascular system. It can affect your metabolic processes. It can affect the ability for your body to actually use food for the intended purpose, because there's so much fluid in our body, and water is required as a substrate. It's like required in a lot of the reactions to actually use food or use our nutrients for various functions, that if we don't have enough fluid, it's actually going to slow down the process of us actually being able to use those nutrients for the intended purpose throughout our body. All right. So we need to make sure we're getting in enough fluid. Here's my general recommendation, is that you start off with getting half of your body weight in ounces. All right. If you weigh 100 pounds, you're aiming for at least 50 ounces of fluid in a day. And a lot of times, and this is outside of any training. So if you're training a ton and sweating when you're working out, you need to drink more. If you're in a really hot space and you're sweating more, you need to have more. If you're sick, that actually increases your fluid needs as well. So you're going to need more than that. That is a general baseline for like an everyday, I'm not doing anything extra, half your body weight in ounces. All right. Now, a lot of times people will be like, hey, does this count as water? Does this count as water? Here's the deal. Your body needs water. So drink water. So water or carbonated water. You can make an argument of what's hydrating. Like, what about iced tea? And what about this? And what about that? And what about like your body needs water. Are there other hydrating fluids? Yes, there are. But I don't like getting into the nitty gritty, because most of the people that are asking me that are not drinking enough water in general. So first get water in, and then talk about other ways that we can use hydrating fluids. But we need to increase your water intake because your body needs water. So let's do that. Indicators for appropriate hydration, right? Looking at your urine is one way of doing it. A lot of times people are like, does it need to be clear? No, but pale lemonade is a good kind of standard. If you're thirsty, your body's already dehydrated and asking for more. So try to take sips so you don't actually get to the point of thirst. That's kind of a goal. All right. If you are drinking fluid and you're like peeing right away, then you may have an electrolyte imbalance. You actually need electrolytes to pull fluid into your cells. So if you're like, hey, I'm drinking so much water all throughout the day, but I just like pee immediately. Okay. We actually want to slow that down a little bit. So I'd say like, have that with like food, because typically you're going to have some salt in your food, and that will help actually like draw that fluid into cells. You may need an electrolyte. I'm not even getting into supplements in this one, but just be aware, have it with food is the first way to be able to solve that issue, so that you're actually having some other electrolytes that you're actually eating in food that can help draw that fluid in versus just peeing it right out. All right. That is our hydration Rex. So let's go into what does this actually look like in my day-to-day life. All right, let's get into application. So here's a framework that I love to give people when it comes to, all right, great. I know what carbs, fat, and protein do in my body. I know what foods have them in there. I know what micronutrients are. I know I need to drink water. So what does my day look like? Here's what your day looks like. When it comes to meals, I want 3 different things. And so this is what I call the 3 Ps, right? I want protein, I want produce, and I want +1 or an extra food group. So what does that mean? Protein. So for protein, I want you getting 25 to 50 grams per meal. Okay. So the general recommendation, so the RDA for protein has just shifted up to like 1.2 to 1.6 gram per kilogram body weight per day. You're like, great. What does that mean? Okay. You need a certain amount of protein in a day. This is the general recommendation that we have now to be able to maintain health. Here's what I will say. This is maintaining health. Most of the time I talk to people about improving their health, whether they're increasing training. And so I typically will say 1, pounds are easier to use. And I'll typically go slightly above that range and say, if you aim for 1 gram of protein per pound body weight, which is about 2 grams or about per kilogram, right? So it's a little bit higher than this range, but if you aim for that, that's going to be a better spot to help you improve your health if you have anywhere to go. And typically if you're training a lot, that is a good place for maintenance for you as well. All right. If you're like, hey, I really have a lot of, like, I have extra fat on my body and I'm adjusting, I would go off of your ideal body weight, which is like for females, it's 100 pounds for 5 feet and then 5 pounds for every inch over 5 feet. So if you're like, great, I have 50 pounds to lose, but I'm 5'3", your ideal body weight would be 115 pounds. So I'd go with 115 grams, right? And so that's kind of where you should, where you kind of get your estimations for the day. That being said, generally at a meal, you're aiming for 25 to 50 grams per meal. Okay. So what does that look like? 1 ounce of meat is about 7 grams of protein. So that means you need about 4 to 8 ounces of meat per meal if you're going to have meat. And that's what qualifies as that 25 to 50 grams. All right. So you need protein, you need produce. So you need non-starchy vegetables. We need to get that micronutrient load up. And so typically if we're doing produce, I want 1 cup of non-starchy vegetables per meal. So if you have a dinner plate, that's about half of your dinner plate will be about 1 cup. All right. That helps us get to that 25 grams of protein goal for the overall day. And then +1. I normally say this because we talked about how there are different micronutrients associated with different food groups. If we add in a third food group, it allows you to get more micronutrients and other components of your food, right? So +1. So that's like a carb or a fat, or technically like a dairy if you can tolerate dairy as well, right? So, examples of this. So if I'm going to sit down to dinner tonight, right, I can do protein. If I have 4 to 8 ounces, so I'm going to have 5-ounce steak, right? 5 times 7, 35 grams right in there, right? 5-ounce steak, that's going to give me my protein. Produce, I'm going to have some roasted veggies, right? And I'm going to put them on half my plate. So maybe some roasted broccoli. And then +1, I'm going to add a baked potato, right? That's going to be the third thing in there. That's going to meet your recommendations, right? You're going to have lunch tomorrow. You want to bring a salad. Great. You get a big bowl of salad. When we talk about leafy greens, I want 2 cups of leafy greens equals 1 serving. All right. So where I say 1 cup non-starchy vegetables, an asterisk is if you're talking about leafy greens, I want 2 cups of raw leafy greens, right? So maybe I'm having a salad. So I got 2 cups of lettuce in there. So that's going to be my produce. I'm going to put some 5 ounces of grilled salmon. That's at 35 grams of protein. And then +1, I want to put on some avocado. That's a healthy fat. That is my third food group. All right. What about breakfast? Great. Glad you asked. Let's do some sauteed spinach and some eggs, right? So here's the deal. 1 egg is only about 7 grams of protein. So you have options. If you're, hey, I like 2 eggs, great. That's 14 grams. That's not enough. So if you do 2 eggs with some spinach, great. You get produce and half of your protein. Maybe we have some Greek yogurt on the side because about a Greek yogurt cup's going to be about 13 grams. So if you got 13 plus 14, you're going to be over that 25. There you go. And then, so that's going to be produce, protein, and then +1. So technically we're going to get a little bit of protein in there, but it's also going to give you the micronutrients of dairy. So there you go. All right. That's an option there. If you're like, hey, I'd love to add some raspberries on there. Fantastic. Get a little more fiber. I'm okay with that. Right? So 3 P's. We need protein, we need produce, and we need +1 out of meals. For snacks, we have 2 P's. We need protein and we need produce. All right? We need protein because we need that throughout the day. So we need 15 to 20 grams minimum of protein. So if it's like, hey, great, I want hard-boiled eggs. Have 2 hard-boiled eggs. That's about 14 grams. Then you need produce. So what is produce? It adds a fruit or a vegetable. If you're like, hey, I really want to work on increasing my micronutrients, I may need to lose a little bit of weight in order to have a healthful body that I can better support my kids or so that I feel better energy wise. Great. All right. So I would add in a non-starchy vegetable there. So what does that look like? 2 hard-boiled eggs, and maybe you're going to have some baby carrots. All right. If you're like, hey, I'm going to have a snack before I work out, that's when the produce should be a fruit. All right. Protein plus a fruit. So an example might be, again, I'm going to have some Greek yogurt. That's going to give me, if I get one of the high protein, I don't necessarily want the high protein one, but if you're going to have some Greek yogurt, make sure you get enough in your serving so that you're getting like 14 to 16 grams in there. Great. And then you're going to add on some fruit, some raspberries on there. Then you got your produce. All right. So that's an example of some of the snacks. Or you're like, hey, I like 2 Chomps beef sticks. Those are each 10 grams. That gives me 20 grams of protein. And then I'm going to have some bell peppers with, some hummus or something like that. Again, another example of a 2P. So you need protein and you need produce. That is our framework. If we're doing that, then it's going to help you better get to your micronutrient needs, get to your protein needs, and sustain your health throughout the day, right? So overall recommendation. So let's go through it. So another thing I want to talk about is timing. We haven't talked a ton about it, so let's talk about it. Eating every 3 to 4 hours, that's going to support your health. And here's why. Okay. I think a lot of times we get fearful of eating more. Our body, if we're giving our body good food, it's going to break it down, it's going to use it, and then it's going to wait for the next load. I think oftentimes it's an easy mental space to get into when you're thinking of like, oh man, what should I avoid so I don't do something bad? I want us to think about the fact that, again, if we're going to faithfully steward our body, this is a gift and a responsibility. how can we best serve our, how can we best steward our bodies to consume the things that we consume in order for it to function the best way that it can function for its intended purpose. God designed our bodies on purpose. What can we eat to support that design in the way that he's created it to be, right? And so thinking about it from that perspective versus a restrictive perspective creates a degree of freedom. I actually have to get some of these things in so that I can support my body in the functions that it's intended to have. I need energy. I need to get these micronutrients to support my body to do X, Y, and Z. All right. It does take about 20 minutes for your body to feel full. So our body talks to us all the time. I say this all the time. It talks to us all the time. So there are different things that will tell our brain, that will connect our brain and our digestive system saying, hey, I'm hungry. Hey, I'm full. All right. And it takes about 20 minutes when we start eating for those signals to get to our brain that say, hey, I'm not hungry anymore. So one of the things that I think we need to think about is that hunger is a biological signal. If we're hungry, that's our body saying, hey, I need to eat. But then also we need to make sure that we're patient and thinking and listening to our body as we consume food when it's like, hey, look, we're done. I think it's really easy in society today to be on the go. I need to eat this on the go and I'm going here and I'm going there. But I think sometimes we need to slow down a little bit and make sure that we're listening to our body because it is talking to us. So are we paying attention to those hunger and fullness signs so that we can make sure, again, that we're stewarding it well? Our body, yeah. A reminder, we want to drink half of our body weight in fluid ounces. All right. When it comes to our meals, we have our 3 Ps, right? We have our protein, we have our produce, and we have our +1 food group. All right. Those are the 3 Ps for a meal. When it comes to our snack, we have our 2 Ps. We have our protein and our produce. All right. Another thing we talked about before from our micronutrient perspective is we want to make sure we're aiming for 3 colors in a day and 5 across the week. All right. So those are our overall goals for the week. So let's wrap it all up. All right. I think it's important to kind of tie it back to part 1 because everything kind of needs to get tied back to there. When we talked about the theology of the body, we were talking about God made our body intentionally. He designed it intentionally. He made bodies on purpose and he made them with a functional purpose. All right. And now it's entrusted to you as both a gift and a responsibility, right? That is the framework as we go throughout our day, just as a reminder. Right? I think that as we start to learn more about how our body functions, right? As we go through this, it increases our awe in God because our bodies are so intricate. There are so many things that are happening in our body constantly, literally every second. There's so many different things. And as we start to learn the different processes and the different things that are happening in our body, I don't know how you can't just be in awe of this amazing design that he's created. It is mind-blowing sometimes when I think about how intricate it is. And I think that as I become more in awe of his creation, it helps me better understand how to steward it. We talked about this at the beginning, but hopefully that's kind of hit you a little bit as we go through this of he's created this on purpose and he's also created food on purpose to serve a purpose within our bodies. And as we learn what's in food and how it pairs up with the functions of our body in this design that he's created, it's really cool because it gives us ideas of all right, now when I steward it, I can choose to do this because I'm stewarding this gift. I'm faithfully stewarding my body well for your glory. All right. Just similarly, I was thinking about it, as we dig into our hearts, right? As you know God more, you dig into your hearts. You want to know the intention of why am I doing that? Does that align with what God wants for me? Similarly, it's as we learn more about our body, and we're learning about how it functions, am I stewarding this? Am I being faithful in understanding what this does for my body so that it aligns with God's purpose and intention for my body as well? So as we kind of wrap this up, I kind of want to leave you on this note that honoring God's design, it's not about chasing a specific body type. It's all about faithful stewardship. Hey, and welcome to part 3 of this course. I'm really excited that today we're going to be talking all about training. Now, in part 1, we dug into scripture to learn what does God actually say about our bodies. And in that, we learned that God intentionally designed our bodies on purpose and with a functional purpose. Now, last time in part 2, we learned about nutrition and we talked about how food provides the raw materials our bodies need in order to function in the way that they were designed. Now, today we're going to be talking all about training and how physical training is a way to honor the gift that God has given us of our bodies, and also allow us to physically serve, work, and live faithfully for the glory of God. So let's get started from the beginning and learn about the basics. So let's start off with the fact that I talk about physical activity and I always use the word training. And the reason why I use the word training, or I most often use the word training, and the reason is because training is very specific. It is a structured, intentional physical activity designed to produce a specific adaptation over time. When we train, it is important that we have a goal that we're working towards, and not necessarily for appearance or optimization or perfection or any of that, right? But I think that we need to think about it in the sense of like, if I'm faithfully stewarding my body, what is the intended purpose? Is it for me to be able to serve my family well? And what does that look like? Is it to be able to, do I want to do a marathon? And is that because I'm physically capable of it? That's okay. But training comes with an intentional purpose, and it's figuring out what that is and how God's called you to steward your body and being able to set that as an expectation. I think the word working out is extremely vague and doesn't necessarily allow us to figure out what the intended purpose is behind. So if we use the word training, it gives us that goal and it helps reframe our mindset that we are doing this for a purpose. So I'm going to start with that. All right. So that is why I use that word. Every once in a while I'll use the word exercise, and that's going to be specifically in regards to movement, or because I'm quoting a policy or another recommendation that's been given from someone else and I'm using the wording that they've used. All right. Let's start off with talking about the main principle behind physical training. And that is the fact that our bodies adapt to stress. All right. Very similarly from like a faith perspective, we grow most in our faith when we are challenged the most. That challenge produces, like it says, challenge, it produces perseverance. It produces the growth that we have in learning more about God and relying more on Him, in the dependence that we have on Him. When it comes to our physical bodies, the same thing happens, all right? The more stress that is placed on our body, the more our body is required to adapt in order to overcome it. There's this principle called the SAID principle, which means, the SAID stands for specific adaptation to imposed demand. So that essentially means that our body is going to adapt to the stress that's placed on it. If you were squatting, our body is going to adapt and become better at squatting. If you're running a tremendous amount, your body is going to adapt to be more efficient at that process as well. So our body requires stress in order to adapt, in order to grow physically in that way. All right. When it comes to training, there are a lot of different systems within our body that are involved. And again, I think it's really helpful to understand the physiology of our body, to understand how it works, because one, it creates that awe in just the overall design. Like, God has made this thing and it is wild. Like, if we think about how many things are happening at one time in our body, it is crazy, the design of it. And so not only can we be more in awe of God because of the design of our bodies, but it also helps me personally, and I think it can be helpful to more faithfully steward your body when you understand it as a whole, when you understand what's all connected and why what happens when I do this, this happens. When this stress is placed on it, this is the result. And it allows us to get a bigger picture. So when it's like, hey, I want to be able to serve my family better in this way, whether it means physically being able to serve them and help them move, or whatever that looks like, I think it's helpful to know how this system works to be able to make more informed decisions about how you're choosing to physically respond and physically steward your body. Okay. So let's talk about the different systems that adapt to training. So we have a lot of different systems in our body. All right. One of the most obvious ones that we know, when we train, our muscles are going to adapt, right? And they can adapt in a lot of different ways. So fun fact, we actually have different types of muscle fibers. So our muscle fibers contract in order for our muscles to move. When they contract, they shorten, and that allows us to move. So whether this motion, whether it has to do with our legs, whatever it is, we have two different types. So there's what's called the slow twitch and the fast twitch. All right. Everyone's born with both types of them, but if you have more slow twitch, that means you're going to be more predisposed to doing more like aerobic, more cardiovascular endurance type activities. The fast twitch ones are going to be the ones that are more force driven. All right. That provide more strength. That's why you see different body types. Some people have very slender, like long muscles. They probably have some more type 2 ones that allow them to be able to do more endurance. And there are some people that naturally can be extremely toned and have very strong muscles without as much physical stress put on them because they have more of those fast twitch or those type 2 muscle fibers. All right. That's just a little extra fun fact, just so you know. Everyone's got all of them or has both types of them. How much you have of each is going to be slightly dependent based on your training and also on your genetic predisposition. Our nervous system is going to adapt to training as well, because all movement starts in your brain. All right. So whether you're running, jumping, lifting, heavy things, like, it doesn't matter. All movement starts in your brain. And so when you start to train, there's actually a neurological response or a nervous system response that you get as a result of that. Cardiovascular system, most people know that your cardiovascular system is going to adapt to training, specifically when you do cardiovascular specific physical activity or like training. Our pulmonary system can respond. So most people think, especially, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we're talking about cardiovascular training, is most people think their lungs are responding. Your lungs are involved in physical training because you need to breathe in order to be able to do anything, right? But they actually don't change quite as much. There's a little bit, they're involved in training, but not necessarily a tremendous adaptation that occurs with training. And then connective tissue and bones are also systems that are affected by training. So connective tissue is going to be our ligaments and our tendons and our cartilage. Bones are bones, right? And so some of the things that we see that training actually, some of the changes that we see as a result of training, just kind of add on to it. So we see strength, right? When we stress our muscle. When we stress our muscles, we're going to see there's some strength adaptations. Cardiovascular capacity can change as well. Mobility can change as well. And that involves our connective tissues, our joints, as well as our muscles. Our metabolic health can be affected with training as well. And so we learned last time when we talked about nutrition that metabolism is generally the way that our body is able to use the components of food to do the functions within our body. And so the way for our body to be, so metabolically, it can improve, meaning the efficiency in which our body uses food and the different components of food to do specific functions within our body can change. Bone density can change. So our muscles attach to our bones. And when our muscles pull on our bones, that stress like causes a response that increases our body's ability to like grow the bones, essentially to strengthen them. So most people have heard like, hey, if you strength train, it's good for your bones. That's why, because the pulling on it will create the stress, which creates a repair response. And the repair response actually has us build up more bones. And so it can help increase our bone density. And then, like I said, neurological functions can actually improve as well as a result of training, because there's more neurons are required to fire in order for movement to be able to happen. So those are some of the responses we see for training. So let's kind of get into the foundations of different types of training. Okay. So some of this stuff's like a little bit basic, but it sets the big picture. So if we understand how our body moves and the different components of it, when we start to be like, hey, these are the things that are helpful to do on a daily basis or a weekly basis, then it's like, oh, okay, that's why, because we talked about these different things. So let's talk about different types of tissues. So we talked about different systems, and within different systems, we have different types of tissues. So we have our muscles. We talked about those shorten and they lengthen. When they contract, right, that means that they shorten. When they lengthen, they're not necessarily engaged. All right. We have our tendons. Tendons are going to connect muscles to bone. All right. So most people have heard of like your patellar tendon. Your patella is your kneecap. So it's going to be your muscles connecting to that kneecap, that bone. All right. That is that tendon. Ligaments connect bone to bone. So if we think about like most people have heard of an ACL, right? So anterior cruciate ligament. So that is a ligament in your knee that connects your femur to your tibia, which is your thigh bone to one of your shin bones. There's a little like connective part in there that holds them together. And when that like tears, then bad things happen, right? And so that is an example of a ligament. Cartilage, most people know of cartilage, like there's cartilage in your ear, but there's also cartilage in different joints as well. And then fascia. Most people don't necessarily know about fascia. So fascia is actually a little fun thing. So we have our skin, and underneath our skin, but over our muscles and our different things is fascia. And it's this like essentially like a web of like water cells for like a very simplistic view. And it's like this whole web of like a sac that keeps things in. But that's another layer of protection and connection that allows for like movement. And again, if there's any like sticking in your fascia, it's supposed to allow things to kind of like slide, which allows for more mobility. If there's any like friction in there, sometimes it can limit mobility as well. So those are different tissue types that we see in our bodies. we move in different planes of motion. All right. So we have our sagittal plane, which is everything moving forward and back. So if you're like lunging forward, right? If you're squatting, anytime you do that, you're just like movement is going forward and back. Because when you squat, your butt goes back, right? Your chest is forward. So that's like moving in this forward to back motion, right? Then we have our frontal plane, which is going side to side. So any movement you do going side to side is moving in the frontal plane. Most people, when they grow into adulthood and they're not kids running on a playground or playing sports, there's very little movements going side to side. Most things are just going this way. And so you lose ability to actually engage certain muscles or certain movements because you're actually not moving in certain planes. So fun fact there. And then transverse plane. So transverse plane is essentially any rotational stuff. All right. So anything that's moving about this plane, that is what a transverse movement is. So when we start to think about putting together workouts and ways we should be training, I enjoy making sure that we're moving in all different planes so that we're engaging different muscles that allow us to do that. It's going to also help with improved mobility because you're engaging those different muscles in different planes of motion and allows you to react to changes in life better, which is what we want. All right. We have different types of muscle actions. So there are 3 different types. So first, we're going to talk about eccentric. So eccentric is the lengthening of muscles. Okay. This actually requires the most amount of stress or most amount of force. So think about like, if you have a baby and you're slowly putting them down because you don't want to injure them when you place them down, that takes a lot of stress if they're on your hands and you're slowly going like that. That is an eccentric or lengthening movement of the front side. So like your biceps as you're lowering down like that. Okay. Then we have isometric, which is like basically a pause in between different movements. And then concentric is the contraction. So if you go to put it down, you realize that all of a sudden they're wet, then you're going to pick them back up and move them somewhere to be able to change them, right? That's an example. When you come back up like that, when you're contracting or shortening a muscle, that is a concentric movement. A lot of times I put this in here to say that sometimes in workouts, I'll be like, hey, this is a 5-second eccentric movement. And people are like, oh, what? So eccentric, so 5 seconds of lengthening a muscle in that specific movement. And the reason that's important is because it's going to increase the stress as you are slowly going through that range of motion. So those are 3 different types of those muscle actions. And again, this all comes together when we start to put together workouts, but this is the basics of just like movements in general. All right. So when we start to talk about strength training, so we're going to talk about strength training and then we're going to talk about cardiovascular training because there are two different types of training, right? So let's start off with strength. I love strength training personally. I think it's really fun. And there are some people that are like, I have to do strength. I love cardiovascular stuff, but I force myself. And there are other people that are like, I love strength stuff. I force myself to do cardiovascular. And then there's some people that are like, I don't really like any of it. So sorry for those people. It's still important. But I tend to lean on the side of I love strength training, but I think all of it is important and necessary for appropriate stewardship, or like not appropriate, but faithful stewardship. All right. So let's talk about strength training. So there are different goals when it comes to strength training. All right. I think it's really important to think about this. When you are training, there are different goals and different training styles to be able to achieve different types of goals. So I think most times when people are like, hey, I want to get stronger. Okay, in what way? And what are we talking about? So when we're talking about strength training, all right, you can lift weights for different purposes. So there's one, it's called hypertrophy. So what is this? This is increasing the size of your muscle fibers. So in an extreme case, it's bodybuilding. In a normal case, when most people say like, I want to be toned, like they want to increase the size of their muscle fibers so that they are visible. That is hypertrophy training. All right. Hypertrophy training is actually important for everybody who needs a base because essentially before we can start adding on to something, you need a base of engaged muscle fibers. And when anyone's starting doing any hypertrophy is going to initiate that process. And I know that most people are like, well, like, I don't want to get like super big. Like that is a nutrition and a strength goal together is what's going to elicit that. I think overall, just putting some stress on your muscles and increasing the fiber size is a base that everybody needs. And so that's what hypertrophy is. All right. Strength is increasing the density of the muscle fibers essentially that you have. So you can increase the size of them, and then you can increase the density of them. So strength allows you to just produce more force. All right. Lift more things, lift heavier weights. That is strength, right? Power, on the other hand, has a speed component to it. So if someone is powerful, most people would use the word explosive. All right. What that involves is both like training, being able to produce force, so strength, and also speed. So we see this a lot in athlete training. You need to be able to produce force, and you need to do it really, really fast. Sprinters require this because in order to be able to move your body weight fast, your body weight is what it is, right? And to be able to move that off of one leg really fast in one direction requires a lot of power. Power is, I think, really important as we age because it's one thing that we stop doing. When you're a kid, you sprint, whether it's in gym class or recess or playing outside with your friends, and you jump. Most of the time, as you get older, you stop sprinting and you stop jumping, which decreases your body's ability to react quickly to different stimulus. And like we said at the beginning, your neurological system is one of the things that adapts with increased training. Your ability to respond quickly to different stimulus, all right, is something that helps prevent falls and prevent injury. So being able to do some power training in your physical training is super important to be able to keep those neurological firing, to keep the neurological firing speed up. Because if you're walking, you start to fall off a curb, most little kids can catch themselves. They might fall down, but they can pop back up. Most middle-aged adults, they can do that as well. When you get older, your inability to be able to appropriately respond to uneven pavement or someone running into you or something like that can be the difference between long-term health and quickly going downhill. And so power training helps with that. Being able to jump, being able to produce force fast is really helpful from a functional protective perspective. If you're thinking, hey, I want to be able to serve my family, be able to play with my kids or my, relatives of whatever they are, your ability to be able to produce power, to be able to run around with them, to be able to jump with them on a trampoline or on the ground or something like that is going to require some power. And so training that to safely be able to do it can help you. And then there's muscular endurance. And so this, again, is another form of base. Typically, this kind of gets intermingled with cardiovascular training, to be honest. If you're doing regular, if the frequency of your training and the volume of your overall workouts, meaning if you're if the time spent actually training, that actually helps to kind of develop this. Now, some people have talked about hey, being able to do small movements, really light movements for a lot of reps. Again, most of the time, cardiovascular training is going to be able to serve this. Most of the time, people don't have to specifically try to do a lot of muscular endurance because from a long-term perspective, it's not the most protective. It's kind of included in every other workout, so it doesn't need to be specifically targeted, in my opinion. There are different program variables that you adjust in order to get the goal that you want, right? Here's what I mean. So volume, meaning the number of reps and sets, is going to produce very different things. If you're going, so for example, if we're trying to do hypertrophy, we're trying to increase the size of our muscles. We want moderate intensity for moderate amount of reps, moderate to high, right? So what do I mean? We're talking 55 to 75% of your estimated max, and you're going for 8 to 12, 8 to 15 reps, right? You're oh, I always do that. If great, are you doing it at the intensity or are you just doing a lot of physical activity, right? If your intensity is too low, you're not actually eliciting the responses. On the other hand, if we're talking about power, so if we're talking about being able to elicit power, you want to be able to move things really, really fast. So the intensity is low, but the speed is really high, or it's a really high intensity, meaning 85 to 95% for 1 to 2 reps, right? And if you're doing that, then that's being able to produce a lot of force, and then you're working on a speed component in a different way. Strength is going to be anywhere from 75 to 90% that you're working at. And so that's being able to hit a certain threshold. So you need to be able to hit a certain threshold for a certain, so most time people are like, I want to get stronger, but they're only working at 55%. You're actually not building strength. You might be building something, but you're not building strength. If you've done nothing before, then that 55 is probably higher. Like the relative intensity might be a little bit higher. But if we're talking about normal people who are active throughout the day, doing stuff at 55% is like probably not going to get you to build strength, right? The only exception is if you go to like absolute failure. Like if you're going to take something and you're like, I'm at 55, but I'm going to do it for 500 reps until I physically can't do anymore, then you might be developing strength. But most people aren't actually doing that. Okay. So volume, so like number of reps you're doing so if you're doing low reps, you're going to be developing strength or power, depending on the intensity. You're doing higher reps up to about 15-ish, 15, like 8 to 15, whatever. You're going to be working on more like hypertrophy. If you're doing more reps than that, then it's muscular endurance. If we're talking about intensity, so that has to do with like relative to 1 rep max. If you're like, I've never 1 rep max, this is where something like an RPE scale comes into play. And so RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. So sometimes you can like Google up different charts with it, but essentially there's like, you can go anywhere. There are different scales, but most of the time I'll use a 10-point scale. 1 being like, no, the rate of perceived exertion is like super light. You're not really like doing anything. You're just laying down. Versus like 10 is I cannot finish something I've maxed out and I can't do any more reps. 5 is like light medium. Most of the time when I talk about trying to elicit a response of something, I'm talking about you're needing to get to like 8, 8.5, which is like, it's hard for me to finish, but I probably have 2 to 3 reps left in the tank. 9 means like I might have 1 rep left, but I'm like grinding it out. Like I said, 10 is absolute max effort. So a lot of times if you're like, I don't really know what my relative max is, you don't need to know, but you do need to know how hard is it. If you could do something and stop and you're like, I could do like 10 more reps, then you're probably down at like a 2 or a 3 RPE. That's probably not, unless you're working on muscular endurance and just getting blood flow, that's probably not going to get you towards your goal. So it's working towards that. So volume, number of reps, intensity is important, rest intervals. Okay, this is a big thing too. I find that a lot of people are like, I want to build strength. So they start doing some activity and they might even get to it, but they're like, I couldn't finish it. Then you didn't rest enough. So a lot of times, so if you're working on hypertrophy, you're probably only resting maybe like a minute, maybe 90 seconds between your different sets, versus if you're doing actual strength work, you're probably going to have to rest a little bit longer in order to be able to hit the intensity and maintain it. So you're probably going 2-3 minutes, maybe even more rest in order to be able to get there. If you're at a gym and you're like, hey, I've seen these guys who like do something and then they like sit there on their phone for like 10 minutes and they do the next one, they're probably working on strength. I would not recommend sitting on your phone. I don't think that's actually helpful, but the amount of rest that is required, again, 10 minutes is a little long, but I normally say like 2 to 5 minutes of rest in between is what's going to be required in order for you to hit the intensity you need to be able to develop strength. And then frequency. And so that has to do with how regular. If you do 1 strength exercise a week, that might be enough to start to think about developing strength, but are you actually going to grow your strength versus if you're doing it twice a week or 3 times a week? So the frequency just allows for you to be able to meet your goals. All right. If you're doing 1 hypertrophy exercise 1 time per week, you're going to plateau at some point, versus if you're doing something 2-3 times a week, then you're probably going to be able to achieve the goal versus just maintain something. And that's going to affect it. So when it comes to actual foundational movement patterns, I've worked with a lot of athletes. And so when we work with athletes, we have foundational movement patterns that we utilize to make sure that they're prepared to be able to move in all different directions. And these are some of the most basic foundational movement patterns that I recommend at any strength training program, whether you're working on hypertrophy, strength, muscular endurance, power, whatever it is, because this allows you to have like a full encompassing type of program that's going to hit the things that you need. And so here's what it is. If you have a squat variation, a hinge variation, a push, a pull, a carry, and then I'll put in here also like a rotation or an anti-rotation. I say this because that can be added into it too, but I think the other ones are most important. And then that rotation or anti-rotation gets that transverse plane that we talked about before in there as well. The other ones are going to be crucial for everyone. The rotational stuff can get built into that as well. And so squats can be double leg squat. There can be tons of variations. And so some of this stuff we'll kind of get to in the end when I have like a little framework for you guys. But these are the main movement patterns. Again, if you have one of, and then I'll say this also, I like doing single leg movements in there as well. And so the hinge or the squat, because those are lower body movements, can actually be single leg. But they're also, if they're not, I would add in a single leg movement because as just human beings, it's important to isolate the single leg movement to develop that strength and help with coordination and a lot of other things as well. So I'll say that. I put down here progressive overload. In order to be able to achieve whichever one of these you want to achieve in regards to the training goals, there needs to be progressive overload. Meaning, if you're using the same amount of so muscular endurance is the one thing that like you can stay stagnant and you're basically just like I said, it's more cardiovascular. You're not actually like pushing anything. You normally don't have to try on that one. You can maintain status quo. But if you're working on strength, hypertrophy, or power, in order to be able to produce those, or in order to be able to reach those goals, all right, there needs to be progressive overload. Meaning, if I'm starting off and I'm working on hypertrophy and just building a base of muscle fiber recruitment, okay, I might start off by doing 3 by 10 and we're talking about overhead presses, right? We're going to start off with doing 3 by 10 with 10 pound weights. If I do 10, there's going to be a point where that is no longer hard, right? And so intensity is going to need to increase in order for me to be able to further develop that. So once it gets, maybe I do it for 2 weeks, it gets easy. Then the next week, all right, we're doing it for 15 pounds with the same amount of reps. All right. So you need to be able to take weight and hit higher reps or decrease the reps and increase the weight, right? We need to be able to increase weight. We don't necessarily need to increase the reps. All right. If you're working on hypertrophy, you might be increasing reps. So there are 2 ways to do progressive overload. Like I said, we can do 3 by 10 on overhead press. The first 2 weeks, we're going to do 10 pounds. The next 2 weeks, we're going to do 15. And then the next 2 weeks, we're going up to 20s. Or if we're developing hypertrophy, the first week, we're going to use 10 pounds and we're going to go for 10 reps. The second week, we're going to do 3 by 12. So we're increasing it. The third week, we're going to use the same weight. We're going to go 3 by 15. But if you're increasing the reps and you're decreasing the weight, then you're just staying there, right? Or if you're just keeping the same amount of weight for the same amount of reps, you're just staying there. So we need to progressively increase the weight in order progressively overload the system to create the stress so that our body can adapt. So that's important to go in there. All right, let's talk about cardiovascular physiology and training. So we're first going to start off with physiology just because physiology is fun, right? This is my master's degree in, and I think it's fun to talk about. So I'll be short on this because I know not everybody loves science, but it is important to understand. We have different energy systems, all right? The way that our body uses fuel to be able to produce energy is different. So when it comes to physical training, there are different ways to be able to train cardiovascularly in order to be able to develop the different energy systems. So we're using all of them all of the time. But which one we're most dependent on is going to be dependent on the type of training that we're doing. All right. So if we're doing short duration, high intensity work, we're going to be using what's called the ATP, PCR, the phosphagen system. All right. What this stands for is mainly we're using the phosphocreatine. Most people have heard of creatine, phosphocreatine in order to produce energy. Typically, we're only using this if it is high intensity and the exercise is only lasting like 0 to 10 seconds. So like you're doing a short sprint, that's how your body's getting energy. Why do we need that? It doesn't produce a lot of energy, but it produces it very fast. It doesn't need a lot, all right? The second way that we produce energy is in the glycolytic system. And so this doesn't require a lot of oxygen. So this is typically anything that's high intensity and is lasting for like that 10 seconds up to about 3 minutes. All right. And so for the first 90 seconds, actually, we're mainly not using energy. And then for the second 90 seconds, we're actually starting to use, we're not using oxygen the second 30 seconds, or a second set of 90 seconds, we're starting to use a little bit more oxygen, but it produces still not a ton of energy. It produces some energy faster than the first system, but it still needs to be high intensity, and it requires carbohydrates for this. So anything that's like high intensity for up to 3 minutes, we're using this, and we're using carbohydrates, right? High intensity up to 3 minutes, it's all carbs. So if you're, I don't know, you're sprinting around a track and it takes you 2 minutes to do it, this is what you're using, right? If you're going to do anything that's high intensity, even if you're like, hey, I'm going to do some sort of like boot camp thing and I'm doing 30 seconds of work and then I'm going to rest, right? Those 30 seconds of high intensity stuff, you're going to be using this energy system. And then we get to what's called our oxidative system. And that is when we produce energy for anything, any activity that's lasting 3 minutes or longer. All right. When we get to the oxidative system, we can break down carbs, we can break down fat, we can break down protein, all in this system. It just depends on the level of intensity of our exercise, of which one we're using for fuel, right? So if you're just sitting there, then we're using the oxidative system, but we're using mostly fat. If we maintain high intensity stuff, right? We're going for a run for 30 minutes. That's higher intensity. So that's going to be using carbohydrates for that oxidative system to be able to produce energy. So those are different energy systems. Again, it's good to know what we're using, but higher intensity, we use carbohydrates. Low intensity, like sitting here, right? We're going to be using fat as an energy system. And if we're in a very extreme state, then we're going to be using protein as well. So there we go. We're always using carbs, fat, and protein as a fuel source. How much we're using is going to be dependent on the intensity of our exercise or what we're doing, or our physical training, right? So those are different energy systems. Let's talk about, most people have heard of training zones. So when we're talking about cardiovascular training, this is typically what people talk about in regards to the levels of it. So there's what's called heart rate training zones. And so there are 1 through 5 that we use. And it's all based on your heart rate max, all right, or your heart rate reserve. Most people do your heart rate max because that's easiest to estimate even if you don't have it. And so the simple way of finding your estimated heart rate max, if you don't want to do like an all-out fitness test to figure out what it is, because that's kind of rough, is 220 minus your age. Now that is a very generalized way of figuring it out. If you're like, hey, but like that is like really low for like what it is, great. If you have like any sort of technology, sometimes it'll calculate your heart rate max for you and you can just use that anyways. But if not, that's an estimated way to be able to start. All right. So zones are going to reflect like what your heart rate max is. And so most of the time people talk about this when they're talking about cardiovascular training. So we have zone 1, that's extremely light. I would call zone 1 just physical activity. You're going for a walk, you're cycling, your heart rate's not really going up. This is just good for blood flow. But when we talk about actually stressing your system, there's typically not an adaptation that's happening. It's just activity. All right. Which isn't bad. But when we're talking about training for specific adaptation, there's no adaptation coming from here. This is just being. All right, zone 2. A lot of times people recently have been talking about zone 2, and it's light to moderate intensity. And the reason we talk about zone 2 training is because this is great at building a base. And when people are talking about improving their body composition, all right, they're going to talk about zone 2. And the reason is because if we're working at 60 to 70% of your heart rate max, this is about, when I said earlier about energy systems, the higher intensity our training is, the more carbohydrate we'll use. The lower intensity, we're going to use fat as a long-term energy source. Zone 2 is essentially the highest intensity you can go, where you have to produce energy before we go into using carbs as our energy energy source. So this can be considered the fat burning zone for that reason. We're able to use fat because it's low enough intensity to use fat before we transition over. This is normally like fast walking. It can be a rucking, or like walking with a weight vest on. It can be like steady state, like cycling, an easy jog, hiking. These are some examples of what zone 2 training is. Again, this is good because it's going to push your cardiovascular system. It's going to be light to moderate. It's going to allow your body to be pushed a little bit and be able to figure out from like more of a metabolic response. Our body's figuring out how to utilize the components of food best to serve our body most efficiently. So that is what zone 2 training is great for. Zone 3 is like moderate intensity training. And so I find that most people, when they talk about doing cardiovascular training, they're working in zone 3 because it allows you to sweat, but it's not the most uncomfortable you can be. And so in here, you're going to have some development of your cardiovascular system. But I will say this, it's typically not high enough to elicit that strong of a response. It does push you. I find that most of the time when we're training in zone 3, it's more comfortable and helpful from mental clarity perspective, more so than it is from a physical adaptation perspective. If you're trying to get more, you enjoy running, and so that's a way to be able to get your heart pumping, which is good from a cardiovascular health perspective. Great. This is a way to be able to serve that. I find that most time when people are like, I want to be able to run faster or run this way or improve body composition because that's going to serve my body in XYZ for XYZ reasons. This normally doesn't help necessarily from a body composition perspective, but it does increase your body's ability to be able to like pump blood. It can help from that perspective. All right. And then zone 4 is hard. It's when your heart rate's about 80 to 90% of your heart rate max. This is where you might see hill sprints, harder runs. This, you're going to have more adaptation from a cardiovascular like capacity perspective. When we're talking about training, this is, I like zone 2 for building a base and zone 4 for producing adaptations from a cardiovascular perspective, because this is going to get you uncomfortable enough that you cannot sustain it for a long period of time, but being able to push it hard and then be able to rest a little bit and then do that actually helps from a capacity perspective. And I really enjoy this type of interval training. If you're doing it correct, like intervals, like you shouldn't be able to sustain this for an extended period of time because you'll physically be inability to sustain that level of intensity, and then you're required to rest. If you were to have a heart rate monitor on and someone were to say that person is in shape, what you would see on the heart rate monitor graph is you would see it go up with exercise, and the faster someone can come back down to normal after like getting their heart rate up really high indicates that they're more in shape, because their body can produce, like their body can increase the heart rate that it needs to and then level back down and adapt back to normal very quickly. We want to see that adaptation back to normal because that shows cardiovascular health. So being able to push it in this high of an intensity, to this high of an intensity is going to push the capacity a little bit more and force a stronger adaptation, which is why I enjoy this. Zone 5, unless you're an elite athlete, you're probably not going here, right? This is like fitness test. I'm going to a fitness test till I physically cannot produce anymore. The average adult, I do not recommend getting here because one, they're not really prepared for it and it's not necessarily required. If you are an elite athlete, this is helpful because it's going to give you information that you can gauge your different workouts off of. But I would say that a lot of times getting all the way up to zone 5 is really hard for the average adult and not necessarily recommended. So those are different types of cardiovascular training modalities to consider. All right, so let's talk about recommendations while we're here. So we talked about the what, now let's talk about like how you actually do it, right? So what are the general recommendations? The general recommendations, according to the recommendations in America, are that you get 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week from a cardiovascular perspective, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise per week. So that 75 to 150 is more of that zone 4. 150 to 300 is going to be like that zone 2-3 range, essentially, per week. Okay, and I will say this. That 150 to 300 is for maintaining health. All right. that's where these recommendations are set, is like, if we want to maintain health, you stay on the lower end. If you want to improve health, it's going to be that higher end of the range. That's where that comes from. 150 a week maintains, 300 is intended to improve. And I will say this, if you haven't been training, anything is going to lead to an improvement. Once you hit a comfortable level of training, then this is what is going to kind of like shape that as well. Strength training, the general recommendations are 2 times per week for 30 to 60 minutes, essentially, and making sure that you hit all major body movements, upper body, lower body, the whole gamut, right? And then mobility, doing that daily is going to be helpful. I will say this, like I said, there's a difference between building and maintaining. Maintaining, once you get to a certain level of health, maintaining actually feels easier. One, because it's part of your norm. So like it's not as hard. It's easier to maintain a habit or maintain habits than it is to actually build them, right? And also, like, your body has become, because the adaptations, more efficient at various things. And so being able to maintain feels easier because it has become more efficient versus building and teaching your body how to adapt to different changes. Adaptation is going to require discomfort. And I think people need to remember that. Like, when you get in shape, it is hard. It is very uncomfortable. But your body needs that stress in order to adapt. Staying comfortable does not lead to adaptation. And then also, I will say this, is that I think oftentimes we get into especially as we start to talk about strength training. Strength is having a minute right now, and I'm for it because I think strength training is extremely important. I think we all know cardiovascular training is important because our heart is important. Strength training, I think, is equally as important. We need to hit both of them. When people start to strength train, I think one of the things that's really hard is you typically do not sweat as much as you do from a cardiovascular perspective, and it can feel like you are not doing anything. But that is not true, because the quantity of sweat that you produce does not necessarily indicate the quality of the workout. So you have to keep in mind what the overall goal is for your training session and not let the extra variables that do not point towards that goal to get in the way. All right. If you are not sweating, but you do a quality strength training workout, that is great. And that is beneficial whether or not you sweat it. And sometimes if you're a heavy sweater, you're just going to sweat at everything. And sometimes you don't sweat at anything. And then there's some people that have a varying degree. So you just have to keep that in mind. Strength is also delayed gratification. So much like nutrition, if you're trying to figure out how your body is going to react to various things and you're making some adaptations, you're going to see them over time. Same thing happens with strength. Strength builds over time. And most of the time you will feel strength adaptations before you will see any physical changes. And that can be challenging, but that doesn't mean that you're not actually making progress. Okay, so I've had many people ask me, and so these are some general benchmarks that I think are super helpful when we're thinking about, all right, for adults, like, great, that's what I'm supposed to do from a day-to-day perspective, but what should my goals be? Now, there's some people that are like, hey, I've always wanted to run a marathon. Go get it, have fun, train for that, figure out a quality training program and do that. There are some people that are like, I just want to be healthy. What does that look like? So I've created some general benchmarks, and this is what I find can be helpful if you, in saying, okay, so this is not necessarily like, this is not like this organization said these are the benchmarks. Some of this is based on research of what can be healthy. And then also, I've been a strength and conditioning coach for many, many years. And the people that I've interacted with, if people were physically capable of doing this, they were in a pretty high quality of health. Like, they were in a good standard. So here's what I would say for most females, right? Female adults. If you can do 10 controlled bodyweight squats, 10 controlled walking lunges on each leg, 5 controlled push-ups, 1 pull-up or chin-up, I'll give you that one. You can do a dead hang, like literally hang on a bar for 60 to 120 seconds. All right, you can carry 50% of your body weight in your hands. So if you weigh 100 pounds, that means, can you put 25 in each hand? So that's 50 pounds, and walk for 25 yards. Can you jump and land safely? Like, literally jump off the ground and land safely. And can you skip? Skipping is going off of one leg and landing on that same single leg and then going to the other leg and doing that. If you can do all of those, I would say that you are in pretty good health, right? Can you jog? In addition, from a cardiovascular perspective, can you jog? If someone said right now, go jog a mile, could you do it? If you can do it, I would say you're in a pretty good, it doesn't need to be fast, but literally do it without stopping to have to walk or sit down or whatever. And then mobility perspective, can you do a straight leg? So you lie on your back and you raise your leg. Can you get to 90 degrees? That would be indicative of hamstring like flexibility and appropriate range of motion at that hip joint, right? Can you deep squat without your heel lift? So regardless of how wide your feet are, can you like get your hips below your knees without your heels coming off the ground? Can you do 90-90s without your hands? That's sit on your butt, have your knees and hips at 90 degrees, and then flip your knees to the other side of your body without putting your hands on the ground. That's going to be indicative of hip mobility. And then full overhead shoulder flexion. Can you go against a wall, keeping your low back on it, and raise your arms up here and get all the way for biceps next to your ears? All right, that would show that your upper body, your shoulder is going to be flexible. And so if it's limited, is it your lats or is it your shoulder joint? So being able to assess those are certain ways to be able to be like, if you're like, hey, I need general goals, I got them for you. Let's see if we can work towards this. So a couple of things I want to make points about just as general rules of thumb. So walking versus running. When people are like, oh, I kind of jog or walk or whatever. Okay, so here's the difference between walking and running. Walking, you always have at least one foot on the ground versus running. You're going to have like a flight phase. So there will be a portion of time where both of your feet are off the ground. So that's how I differentiate, because some people have asked me before, what's the differentiators? That's the differentiator. Then also mobility versus flexibility. Flexibility is purely the ability to passively like lengthen a muscle. So that's when people like stand there and they try to touch their toes. That will passively see if you can let your hamstring flexibility. I care more about mobility, which has to do with range of motion. All right. Can you move through a complete range of motion at a joint? So whether it's your hip joint, your knee, your ankle, your shoulder, your elbow, your wrist, whatever it is, that is going to be important. And flexibility, so like how tight your muscle is, may impact that, but it may also be the joint. So I care less about the fact that you're not tight. I care more about the fact that you're able to move the way you want to move. And so that's where mobility and flexibility kind of differ. All right. All right. So let's talk application here in the end. So I have this thing called the training triangle. And so I say this because it's in threes. And so that's an easy way to think about it. Can we do 3 days of strength training, 3 days of cardio, and then mobility each day? That would close your mobility. That would close your training triangle. So on each point of the triangle, if you can think of a cardiovascular and a strength training in each of those, then that is your training triangle. So the goal for this week is to complete your training triangle. So here is a make your own workout, and this is going to be in your worksheet for the week as well. So let's look at it. So the way I have it set up is on each day, there's something to do. And on one day you rest, because rest is good and your body needs to recover. And so there needs to be one day of no planned physical activity. If you go for a walk with a friend, when you grab coffee, whatever, great. But that is not actual physical training. I want physical training on the other days. And then one day needs to be complete rest. Okay. So here is an example of what your week can look like. So we have strength training on 3 days, followed by a 20-minute walk. I find that is a helpful way to get an extra like heart rate work afterwards, and also helps with mental clarity and movement and mobility as well. Okay. So when it comes to your strength training days, these are the exercise options that I talked about before when we talked about our main movement patterns. All right. So these are some options you'll be able to look at, and you can pick and choose what you do each day. All right. So if we go down here, again, this is in your worksheet. Every day before you do a strength training exercise, it's really important that you warm up. And so this is a simple warm up, is that if you do 20 jumping jacks, because you need to get your heart rate up and your blood pumping, then I have a mobility series, which can get your hips and your muscles ready. So you're going through range of motion, active range of motion. If you do 3 rounds of that, you should be good to go. It should take you 5 to 7 minutes. Then you're good to start lifting. All right. It tells you 5 rounds. It tells you how many reps you do on each of them. So this, you get to pick and choose which fits in each category. So if you're like, hey, I don't have any exercise equipment, great. You're going to go over here. You're going to go squats. We're going to do body weight squats, and you're going to write them in here. Then you're going to go, all right, You're going to figure out if there's no weight, there's no weight. Then you're going to do pull. All right. I'm going to do a chin up, or I'm going to do a lat pull down. You figure out what you have. You write them each in here. I will say this. If you choose a body weight exercise, I want you to try to do a 5-second eccentric tempo. So what does that mean? That means you're going slow in the elongating movement. So for example, if you're doing squats, it should take you 5 seconds to get down to the bottom of a squat in the eccentric. If you're doing a pull up, and you can't do it, you're going to pull up and then you're going to take 5 seconds going down. So that is what you're going to work for if it is a body weight movement. All right. So this is how you apply all this stuff, is in your training triangle. So check your worksheet out, because it's going to make your own workouts on there. So we have our strength training days followed by a 20-minute walk, and then you have your 3 days of 30 minutes of cardio. So if you do all of this, it should get you to, right, 30, 60, that's 120 minutes of, right, 30, 60. That's more than 120 minutes. That's 90, 150. I did it right. Yay for math on the spot. I did it earlier. I should have written it down, but it's 150. I was like, I got you to the bottom of the range. So this is your minimum amount of cardiovascular to get started. If you're like, hey, I want to build, then you can easily start to increase that to maybe 45 minutes on each of those others on the next day, on the next week. And then on week 3, you're doing 60 minutes of cardiovascular on those other 3 off days where you're not doing strength training. So that is what it looks like. So hopefully you have something to take away with you and actually start to practice this week. So let's bring it all together, because at the end of the day, we talked about the physiology. We talked about what it looks like in practice. So now let's wrap it back up. So let's talk about this. The body is designed, like I said, to adapt. So we need to put it under stress in order for it to adapt. Training, our physical training, is a cooperation with design, right? It provides the stimulus. And then nutrition, we talked about last time, is going to nourish the adaptation. So we need to stress our body, and then with food, we allow it to recover and adapt to that stress so that it can grow stronger, whether it's cardiovascularly stronger, whether it's muscularly stronger, whether it's stronger bones, right? It allows for that adaptation. We build physical capacity so that we can serve well, so that we can work well, so that we can lead well, so that we can endure well, and so that we can show up consistently in our vocation, whatever it is that you do every single day. All right. This is not about perfection. This is all about responsibility, right? It's not an obsession. It is not neglect. All right. It is intentional care for our bodies, for our physical bodies. All right. How we eat and how we train are both acts of faithful stewardship, caring for the body entrusted to us so that we can glorify God in how we live. And that is the goal. Hey, and welcome to part 4 of this course. I'm really excited that today I'm going to talk all about mindset. So I think some of you are probably like, what does mindset actually mean? So here's the thing. I would argue that parts 1 and 4 are probably the most important parts of this entire course. While most people are typically drawn to parts 2 and 3, we talk about nutrition and training and all the ins and outs, right, of the science and knowing what to do. I think first, understanding the theology of the body. What does God say about your body? And what does he say? Like, he says that it's important. All the things that he says in scripture, I think that is first and foremost the most important thing that we can understand, right? Mindset, I would argue, is second, because you can know truth, you can know what to do, but mindset allows us to actually turn that truth, that knowledge, that understanding into action. What is our mind actually telling us? What is actually going to motivate our behaviors? How are we actually going to carry this out on a day-to-day basis? That is all related to mindset. And so mindset is that thing that puts it all together. It helps put these pieces of a puzzle together so we can actually turn truth into action. So as we get started today, I'm going to start off with a little question like, who has ever rented a car? Have you ever rented a car? I think most people have rented a car, or they've been in a rental car. They know of people that have rented a car. And so I typically find that they're one of two people when it comes to rental cars. There are those people that are very particular. They park at a distance because they don't want to get a ding. They make sure the gas is perfect. They are kind of scared and want to make sure that it's taken care of, really, really particularly. They don't want to get a fine or a ding or anything on it, right? They're super cautious with it. Then there are other people that are this is not my car, so I'm going to drive it like I want to drive instead of how I normally drive my own. And they drive it really hard. They drive really fast. They drive recklessly because this is not their car. Whatever. Who cares what happens to it? I find that the reason for this is because ownership actually changes how we treat something. And the similar thing happens to our bodies, right? I think there are some people that are like, hey, I'm just going to use it till it breaks, like whatever. There are other people that are like, this is the only thing that is mine. I'm going to control it. It is my project. I'm fixated on it. There are other people that will ignore and neglect it, but there's like a disconnect between our bodies and ownership. Either they think they have so much control of it or they have absence of ownership. We typically fall into one of two buckets. The thing is that scripture says something different. If you remember back in part 1, and it says that the body is something that's been entrusted to us, right? So that means that stewardship of our bodies is going to change how we approach food, how we approach training and exercise, how we approach health, because it's going to lead to careful and faithful attention to it, right? So today it's all about learning how to think about our bodies rightly, right? What actually changes how we live? How do we take the knowledge and how do we turn that into action? That is the biggest thing for today. All right. So let's recap a little bit of what we've talked about so far. So first, in part 1, we talked about theology of the body, right? We talked about what does God actually say about our body? Like why are our bodies important? Why do they actually matter? In part 2, we went into Nutrition 101. We talked about the basics of food and how that fuels us and supports our bodies to do what they're designed to do. Training was the next part 3, right? And on that last week, we talked about like, how does the body actually adapt to stress? How does it grow stronger? How does it increase the work capacity? All so that, again, in a way so that we can glorify God with our bodies, right? That's what we talked about, all those things. So here's the deal. We have a lot of knowledge at this point, but knowing what to do and actually doing it are two very different things, right? Most people don't necessarily struggle because they know, hey, like most people, if you would ask them like, hey, is a vegetable good for you? Like, despite all the noise in the media, they'd be like, yeah, vegetables are good for you. Like, do you know, is moving your body good for you? Like, yes, I know that's. So most of the time people struggle with health, not because they lack information. It's not a misunderstanding that we need to be like, take care of our bodies, right? Typically, mindset is going to be the bridge between truth and action, right? That is that missing piece. That is a part that inhibits us from being able to take the knowledge we have and turning it into action on a day-to-day basis. All right. So as we get started, can you guess what the reaction is most of the time when I tell people I'm a dietitian? I typically try not to tell people that because of the reaction, right? So there are some people that like most of the time, especially if there's any food around, they're like, oh, like I don't normally eat this way, or I'm being that, or like, I know you wouldn't approve of this. And there's this like weird, like normally physically they'll change. So like avoid eye contact, they get all like shifty, right? Or I have other people that will start to give me like a verbal list of everything they've consumed in the day in order to get like affirmation or like ask questions like, is this right? Is this wrong? This is all the different stuff that I've had. And the same thing honestly happens with like exercise too. I normally don't tell people I'm like a strength and conditioning coach because same thing. I'll be like, oh, these are all the things I've did. Like, this is right. Or like, how would you change this? Or like, a lot of interesting things happen. And why does this actually happen? Right? Because many people feel uncertain, guilty, or ashamed about their food choices. And the same thing happens when it comes to exercise and training and physical training, right? Like there's a lot of shame and there's a lot of like verbalized guilt and uncertainty when it comes to these things. So I hear that a lot when people are, oh, what do you do? Like that all verbally comes out, right? But my question to you is like, what if you can make food choices with confidence? Like I always want to ask them, like, what if you can make it with confidence? What if you understood why your body needed something and you could eat things and you didn't feel guilty, you didn't feel confused, like you just did it with confidence because you knew that's how to steward your bodies well, right? So how do we get there is first step, especially when it comes to food, is we first have to start to think about like, why do we actually choose the foods that we choose, right? I think that most people don't give it that much credit. They're like, oh, like, I don't know, like it doesn't really matter. Like why we choose the foods we choose is actually really important. And a lot typically goes through your mind when you're making that choice. So most people think that it's purely logical. Like, oh yeah, like I know I need to eat this, so I'm going to eat it. Like, no, that's normally not what is happening, right? There's so many different things that actually like food choices are based off of. And this is a list, and it's not even the most extensive list, but there are some things. But like location, like is it available? Is it not? Convenience, like, okay, I could either eat this or I have to go to the store and get something else, or like I could eat this or I have to cook something else, you know, like that's going to impact what you eat. Like cost happens all the time. Availability, like I think most people have heard like, oh, leave this on your counters, that way you eat that more versus not. But it's true. Like if something's on your counter versus you having to go into the closet, like that is going to impact or has the ability to impact whether or not you consume that versus the thing that's in the closet or in the fridge or whatever. Taste, appearance, smell, habit, you know, like, oh, I just always do this, so I'm just going to keep doing that, right? Social environment, like, is everybody else eating this thing, so you're just going to eat it because everybody else is, or everyone's drinking this, so you're going to get that as well, so you don't stand out. Or emotional state, so many people consume things because of emotional state. Is this going to make you feel happy? Is it going to make you feel comfortable? Is it going to make you feel nostalgic? Is it going to make, are you sad? You know, are you bored? Those things can impact the foods that we consume, how we consume them, when we consume them, where we consume them, how much we consume, right? And then nutritional value. And I'll tell you this, probably the least frequent when I'm talking to people, when I'm working as a dietitian with people one-on-one, nutritional value typically has the lowest amount of, most people are not thinking about that when they're thinking about their food choices. They're thinking about other things. Like that might cross their mind, but so many of these other ones actually take precedence over the actual nutritional value. All right. And if you think about it, like our brain actually likes habits. Like it wants to reduce effort and do the easiest thing possible. And that means habit. What you've always done makes it easier to keep doing that, which is why we talk about building habits, because it makes, once you started building a habit, it makes it easier to keep doing that versus doing something that you're not used to doing, right? So this is why telling someone to like eat healthier rarely is going to change behavior, right? Because decisions aren't happening on a knowledge level. It's not like, hey, eat healthier. Oh, you know what? I was only thinking about availability, but now that you brought it up, I should probably think about nutritional value. Like that's, no, like that was probably always there, but the other things trumped it, right? And when it comes to decisions, like I said, most people are pretty habitual. And so trying to logically make a decision when your body is used to habitual things, habitual choices, takes more effort, right? So when we make behavior changes to make wiser, more nourishing food choices, right? It's happening at a level of a mindset and pattern thinking. If we think about this also, like most people, when they go away on a vacation, they enjoy being on a vacation. But what do most people typically say when they get home? They may not want to go to work. They may not want to, I don't know, deal with whatever the stress, go back to school or deal with all the stresses at work. But what do they want? They want to get back into their routine. Why? Because our body likes routines, like being able to do that from like a food choice perspective and just an overall day-to-day perspective. All right. So when we change that routine, change those food choices, it's going to happen at the mindset level, not just a basic choice right now. All right. And the same thing is like when we think about training, right? So food isn't the only place where mindset shows up. It also happens with exercise and training because most people know, like I said before, know that movement's good for them. They know that working out is important. They don't, but most people still struggle to do it consistently, right? So it's not an absence of information. They don't lack information, right? The barriers are typically psychological, not informative. So some of the common mental barriers that can influence training are some of this, like a lot of people, fear of discomfort, you know, training is uncomfortable. They don't want to be uncomfortable, right? Fear of failure. Like you don't want to try to do something and not be able to do it, right? That's a lot of it. Fear of injury. I hear that all the time, especially as we get older. People are like, I'm afraid to start strength training because I don't want to hurt myself. And so that's going to limit them from doing things that could actually benefit their health. Like fear of looking at inexperience. I can't tell you how many people are like, I don't like going to the gym because I don't want to look dumb. I'm like, you've never done it. You're not supposed to look like an expert, you know? Fear of being judged. I think we assume that other people are judging us more frequently than they actually are, right? And also identity are things that are going to potentially inhibit us from making these training decisions. I hear all the time people, I'm not athletic. I'm not a gym person. I'm not that disciplined, right? Oh, I'm not a morning person. Like I can't get up and do it in the morning. And so all these things actually limit us. It's these psychological barriers that tell us why we can't and actually stop us from making those choices, right? Here's the deal, is that training actually requires voluntary discomfort. Our brain is wired to avoid discomfort at all cost. Like it doesn't want to be uncomfortable. It's trying to actually seek comfort. Like it wants to be comfortable. It wants to maintain homeostasis, and homeostasis is not being uncomfortable. All right. And here's the deal. When you're tired, when you're stressed, when you're overwhelmed, your brain is going to tell you do everything that's easy because I want to relieve this stress. I want rest. Right. So why? It wants to get away from that. It wants to avoid that stress. But we have to work to train like our brain, like we have to work on our mindset, right? Decisions to train actually require deeper motivation than just like, hey, I can't just be motivated like, oh, it's time to work out, right? It requires a mindset shift and an identity shift, all right? The question can't be like, oh, do I feel like working out today, right? That's not going to lead to that behavior, right? It's needs to start to shift to what does stewardship look like today for me? And the reality is sometimes you haven't slept, you have worked out 5 days in a week, like that week already, you're super tired, you're supposed to do a 6-day, and like, you know what, rest might be what's happening. Another one might just be like, hey, look, I've been sitting at my desk all day. I'm super tired and stressed from work, but I actually haven't moved all day. And as much as my body is telling me like, hey, you just keep sitting down because you're super tired, what would steward your body well is actually more movement. So there is wisdom that needs to be imparted during this. But again, the question cannot be, what do I feel? It is, what does stewardship actually look like for my body, right? And another question that you can ask yourself is, what helps me care well for the body that God's entrusted to me? So a lot of this comes back to asking yourself questions, right? Because mindset comes from what is actually going on in my mind? What is driving my behaviors? Why am I doing what I'm doing or not doing what I'm not doing, right? Despite the knowledge that's in my brain. And so that is where a lot of this is going to come through, is a lot of self-reflective questions to start to understand, why am I doing these things, so that we can align it with the truth that we know from Scripture. And hopefully that will together is truth from Scripture and the information we know from nutrition and training to be able to turn that into action. All right. So another thing we start to see that's going to inhibit our ability to actually like make choices, make wise choices, is one thing I often hear coming up is when I hear people talking a lot in regards to food, and they're using a lot of language about guilt. And here's my issue with this, is that this is a theological issue when we start to hear this, right? I hear all the time, I feel so guilty for eating that, or I was so bad this weekend. There was a birthday, I was so bad, I had some cake, and I actually had 2 pieces of cake, and then I had a cookie. And so all this stuff starts coming up, right? But let's talk about it. Like biblically, guilt assumes a moral law and a real wrongdoing against that law. All right. So what do I mean by this? So in James 2:10, right, it says, whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. Okay. So when we're saying guilty, this is actually talking about someone who is liable or accountable for a real wrongdoing. Like they did something wrong. They're guilty for doing something wrong. So guilt is not just a feeling, right? It is a moral condition before the law of God. That is what it is saying, right? So you are guilty when you've actually violated God's law. All right? This is not the same as when we talk about eating choices, right? Eating a cookie is not a violation of God's moral law. Like that standalone action, independent of things. Like that is not a moral issue, right? Usually the feeling that we're talking about is shame or moral pressure that's like shaped by cultural ideals and like food and our bodies. And some of this is driven by the fact that like a lot of society and diet culture, we've labeled food, right? There's some foods that are good. There's some foods that are bad. There's some that are clean. There's some that are dirty. And so because of association with these, we start to feel shame associated with consumption or lack of consumption of these different foods, right? Which is what I was talking about when people find out I'm a dietitian. It's all the shame starts to become verbalized in front of me. But here's the thing. When people eat foods that are labeled bad, they then start to themselves feel bad, all right? And then food becomes moralized at this point. And scripture repeatedly emphasizes that the goodness of food, right? That food is good. And we talked about this in part 1. We read Genesis 1. And so we'll go back to read Genesis 1:31, where it says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day." All right, so here's the deal. Food is part of God's good creation. Like before this, he goes into all of the things, like God describes there's the description of like, this is good for food. And he created all of this. He created man, he created food, he created the earth, right? And all of it was good, food and man, right? When he created it, it was good, right? But that being said, not every food choice is equally wise. So when we're starting to talk about food, it is not morally bad, right? You are not bad because, oh, I'm bad, I ate this, right? It is not a moral condemnation, right? But there is wisdom that needs to be associated with some of our choices, all right? Less nutritious food, missing a workout, not being consistent with working out, it's not a moral failure. You are not bad because you did these things, right? You are not guilty because of that. You have not violated God's law for not doing these things. However, it is an opportunity to reflect on the wisdom of stewardship. All right? And we've talked about faithfully stewarding our bodies is seeing our bodies as both a gift and a responsibility. All right? Here's the thing when we tie in like also some psychology to it, right? So feelings of moral failure, when we feel those, right, the nervous system often moves into shame and stress. Right? So when we feel morally wrong or we've morally failed, we become increased stress. And we know that chronic stress is actually going to impair the brain systems for planning, impulse control, behavior regulation, which means that when we tell ourselves we're bad, when we've made a less nourishing food choice, when we have not stewarded our bodies well, right? And instead of being able to say, hey, that was not a wise choice, we say, hey, that was a bad choice. I'm bad because of that. It leads to a moral failure mindset, which shifts us into shame and stress. And then stress actually impairs our ability to make wise decisions by inhibiting our behavior regulation, our planning, our impulse control. It's going to negatively affect those things. So by condemning ourselves morally, it actually leads to a potential of being able to make poor choices from like unwise choices over and over again. All right. So part of developing a healthy mindset is learning to remove the false moral weight that we're putting on food decisions. All right. And leading them to more shifting over from moral failures to wisdom. All right. And how do we do this? We start asking questions like, did this choice help me steward my body well? Not, was this a good choice? Was this a bad choice? Like, did this help steward my body well? Because at the end of the day, we're talking about faithful stewardship. We're not talking about if you're good or you're bad. We're talking about faithful stewardship of your body, right? And so can we ask these questions? And if we start asking more questions like this versus was this good? Was this bad? Was this right? Was this wrong? Did this choice help me steward my body well? All right. This starts to shift, all right, the conversation from moral condemnation into thoughtful stewardship. And that's what we're really trying to move towards. All right. So when the problem isn't stress, it's neglect. All right. So there's some people that are thinking all the time. They feel guilty about certain things. They're like all up in their mind about it. We have another group of people that simply just don't think about it. They just don't think about their health choices, right? And they neglect it. And it's not that they're like, I'm not going to think about that, because that's actually like still like a thought about it, right? Like they literally have an absence of consideration. They haven't thought, like, it's just like not part of what's going on in their brain. So what does that mean? So it means food is whatever is convenient, right? Like, and movement happens, like if it happens, like movement happens if it happens. And psychology calls this a low engagement, like behavior. All right. Low engagement with behavior. You're just kind of like doing what happens. You're not really thinking about it. You're just like going about your way. All right. And the deeper issue when it comes to this is it means that people actually don't believe that their body really matters. And we know that this is an issue because of part one. It really drives us back to part one and shows us how important part one is when we talk about the theology of the body. Because here's the deal. If the body is neutral or insignificant, neglect makes sense, right? And this doesn't matter. You just like do whatever happens, right? It doesn't really matter if we take care of this. However, if we believe scripture and when it says, scripture talks about how God intentionally made your body on purpose and with a functional purpose, which means that it matters. So if it matters, that means that we're called to steward it. And that means that we need to shift our mindset from neglect to intentional care, right? And not into an obsession part. Like we don't need to fixate on it, make sure that it's like perfect or whatever, but we do need to shift to, we need to start caring about it enough and being thoughtful, right? We need to care about it to be thoughtful with it, to be able to steward it, right? It needs to become part of what we think about. Not overwhelmingly so, but a consideration. All right. Now, in part one, we also talked about posture. We talked about how we relate to our bodies, right? And I think it's important to kind of go back to that because we talked about how we relate to our bodies in 5 different ways. And the way that we relate to our body is actually going to shape how we think about them. And our mindset is going to influence how we approach food, exercise, and health, right? Our mindset about that. So, often we actually like jump between these different postures without even realizing it. So I think it's important to kind of reflect back on them, go over them again, so you can start to consider like, how do I actually think about my body and which of these categories do I fall into when I'm considering how I relate to my body, right? So when your body becomes a source of ultimate pleasure, we talk about this being when we start to indulge a lot. We call this gluttony, right? And so you're actually seeking comfort. You're seeking enjoyment. Like those are the things that are guiding your decisions. You're just doing things that are going to be comfortable, that you're going to enjoy, right? At that point, your body is actually going to control you because as opposed to the other way around, your body is the guide at that point because it is the ultimate source of pleasure, right? When your body becomes proof of worth, this is what leads to fixation, right? This is when we start to fixate on all the different things that affect our body, and health becomes a measurement whether or not you're disciplined enough or doing all the right things. And because of this, our body then takes on the weight of becoming our identity. And that is a weight that it was not intended to carry. All right. When our body becomes the source of ultimate safety, that's when we become that's when we try to control things. Control takes over. Can I manage everything perfectly so that I'm not vulnerable to anything that can happen to it, so that I'm not uncertain? I know exactly what's going to happen. And although this may look on the outside of being responsible, it really is, everything is driven by fear. All right. When the body becomes the source of ultimate meaning, then it becomes something that we worship. And through this, we see that health, performance, appearance, they all function as something that's ultimate. Our performance is ultimate. How we look, how we dress, like how our body is presented is ultimate. And this begins to become our source of identity, our purpose, and our security, right? And it takes over as opposed to that being rooted in Jesus. All right. When the body becomes a gift that's entrusted to us, that's when stewardship begins. All right. The body, we learn in scripture, has been entrusted to us, right? And if we can see it as a gift that carries both responsibility and purpose, all right, then we start to go about things differently in our lives, right? When stewardship becomes the posture, right, as seeing our bodies as both a gift and a responsibility, then health stops becoming ultimate and it becomes a byproduct of living wisely and faithfully. We don't have to seek it all the time. We don't have to control everything to make sure we get there. We don't have to put it on a pedestal and make sure that it's there. We don't have to walk around as our body is proof of that, right? By us making wise choices, it actually becomes a byproduct, and we are just living like we're using wisdom in our choices so that we can faithfully steward our bodies, which become healthy through these wise decisions and allow us to glorify God. All right. The posture we take towards our body is going to quietly shape the decisions that we make every single day. So how do we actually change, right? Like, what does change actually look like? If we're not doing everything great, we want to make things better, we want to start to get to this posture, then how do we actually like change? So I will say this, real change actually happens through identity. Behavioral psychology actually consistently shows that identity-based motivation produces more lasting change than willpower alone, right? That's so interesting, right? That like where our identity is rooted is going to change how we act, which makes a lot of sense when someone has given their life over to God, when they surrender fully to Jesus, right? Our identity becomes rooted in him. It becomes rooted in Christ. And then what happens when our identity is rooted in this? Our behaviors start to change. They have to. That's where everyone's like, why are you acting that way? Because my identity has changed. I can't not. Like, it changes everything. It shifts everything in your mindset. And the same thing happens here, right? So we need to figure out where our identity is rooted. Habits follow identity, not willpower. So part of it is we have to think about what are we actually believing. And when it comes to beliefs, right, we've talked about this a little bit before, I hear a lot of people say different things. And the statements you make about yourself show what you actually feel about it, right? What you believe about it. So I hear all the time, like, if you're saying things like, I'm bad with food, I'm not disciplined, I'm not an athletic person, I'm not a gym person, I don't wake up early, I don't like this, I don't like that, I won't try that, right? If you start saying all of these things, you're claiming an identity. And the result of that is that every healthy action then feels unnatural. However, if we have other beliefs and we can start to shift that mindset into statements of, I am someone who stewards my body well. I'm someone who stewards my body well, right? That shifts that belief, right? That proclaims a different belief. And at this point, both nourishment and movement begins to align with that identity. All right. If we can say things, I'm seeking to faithfully steward my body well to glorify God with it, that is going to change how we see nutrition, how we see training, how we see health, right? Versus the other beliefs that we could say. All right. Neuroscience actually, when we talk about neuroscience, right, most people have heard that your brain is plastic. So what does this actually mean? So neuroplasticity is the idea that repeated thoughts, not the idea, the scientific showing of repeated thoughts strengthening neural pathways, right? The more we think things, the more it's going to change the way that our neurons actually fire. All right. We actually see this said in Romans 12, right? When it talks about renewing of your mind. So in Romans 12:2, it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Okay, renewal of your mind. You're renewing your mind. What are you called to renew your mind? On truth, right? We're called to renew our minds on truth and rooted in scripture. Are we opening up our Bibles? Are we reading what the Bible actually says about us? We've talked in part 1 about what God says about our bodies. Are we reminding ourselves the truth of what he says, that our bodies were created on purpose, intentionally, for a purpose, and have a functional purpose? Right? Are we talking about that? Are we rooted? Because if we are rooted in that, that is going to rewire how our minds actually think about our bodies. All right. And can lead to different behaviors, because truth reshapes thinking, and reshaped thinking leads to new behaviors. All right. So one of the questions I want you to reflect on is, what identity are you rehearsing in your mind? In addition to identity, there are other things that have been shown to help with long-term success. All right. So one more factor that consistently predicts long-term success is accountability. I love this because these are all concepts in the Bible that science has actually backed up. And so when science starts to do like studies and then it backs up what's said in the Bible, I think it's awesome. It's so cool. It's like, finally you caught up, but it's like so cool, right? Okay. So research actually shows about goal achievement is that people who simply set a goal completed about 10% of the time. People who set a goal and tell someone about it completed about 65% of the time. But people who commit to regular accountability check-ins have about a 90% success rate. That is crazy. And I can tell you from experience, like anecdotally, with having worked with as many people as I've worked with in my career from like a nutrition and a training perspective, is that those that are most successful with long-term health are the ones that seek constant accountability, constant checking in. They're the ones that want to get coached. The ones that are like, hey, just give me a meal plan, I'm going to go follow it. You know how many people actually do that? It's so low. I don't even like doing it because I'm like, this is a waste of time. You're not actually going to go do this, most likely, right? What do you need? You need accountability around you. You need that community around you that's going to help hold you accountable to the truths, to your goals that you're trying to do. And that's what research shows, all right? Humans are designed for community. Growth was never meant to happen in isolation, and stewardship works best in community. All right. So not only are we called to root our identity in, like, remind ourselves of what our identity is rooted in and remind ourselves of truth, but staying in community is what is going to lead us to actually long-term success of trying to steward our bodies well, right? We are going to try to faithfully steward our bodies well, and we do that in community. All right. So let's start to align truth with action, all right? Because we can talk about the truth, we can talk about your mind. So how do we start to do this on a day-to-day basis? We're going to do this and we're going to close up, all right? So here's the deal is, preface, I'm not a super mushy-gushy feelings person, so there's some people who this is going to be super fun because you get to think a lot about how you're feeling and what you're thinking and all that different stuff. There are some people that are like, I don't necessarily like doing that. Here's the deal. Introspection is extremely important. So I'm going to provide a framework for this because as we start to change, seek to steward our bodies well, a degree of reflection is very helpful to help us align our mindset with the truth. Make sure that we're actually figure out what's going on in our mind so we can continue to make sure that our behavior aligns with the truth that we're seeking, right? And so let's first start off with, there are 3 things in this framework, right? Number 1, we're going to notice. So what does this mean? So you can do this. I recommend you do this at least once a day. So whether you're reflecting on a meal, on an exercise, or you're at the end of the day, just kind of looking back on the day, right? So it's going to kind of depend on what type of person you are. But first I want you to stop and ask, what belief is driving this behavior right now? So whether it's you're going out to eat with coworkers, and you're like thinking about like what you're going to get, I want you to stop and think about like, why am I going to choose what I'm going to choose, right? Start thinking about that. Why am I going to choose what I'm going to choose? Because we can change our actions, but we first have to be aware of like what's actually shaping them. So why am I choosing this? Is it convenience, shame, guilt, habit, environment? You know, start to reflect on that, right? The second thing is I want you to ask, like, where is this belief coming from? You know, is it, I'm eating this because, you know, I believe that it's going to, you know, like, I feel like everyone's going to accept me if I do this. And where's this belief coming from? Like, last time someone ordered something different, like everyone kind of looked at them weird, they didn't engage them as much. Or like every time everybody else does this, they like seem really happy about it. So I'm going to do this because I care what my coworkers think about me. You know, like, I don't know what the reason is, but start to dig into that first. Like, why am I going to make this choice? Second, what do I believe this choice is coming? Like, what's this rooted in, right? Because many of our assumptions about our body come from sources we've never actually thought about. So I've had people that are going to go out to lunch. They're going to make a decision. I'm making this because I always get this one. And then it's like, well, where is this coming from? Okay, well, I actually believe that that's going to make me lose weight. And so I'm going to do this because I think it's important to lose weight, you know, like, and there's shame if I don't do that. So you have to kind of sift through that of what's actually happening. And this is where we start to separate, you know, cultural messages from biblical truth, you know, and then we're going to nurture it. The last question I want you to ask is, what choice would reflect stewardship rather than punishment or neglect? All right. Is it the same choice? It might be. Is it a different one? Is it the same choice, but we have to kind of like shift why we're making the choice? Some of that is all reflective, all right? Because at the end of the day, we're trying to ask the ultimate question of like, how can I care well for the body that God's entrusted to me, right? Those are those choices. So first we need to notice, then we have to name where the belief is coming from, and then we have to nurture it. Where, you know, like how would this reflect stewardship, or what do I need to change in order for it to help me faithfully steward my body well, right? Because the goal is to move our decisions from reaction to wisdom and faithfulness. All right. We want to make wise choices and we want to be faithful. We want to faithfully steward our bodies. And so those need to come together. And part of that requires a little bit of intellectual thought about it. You need to dig down a little bit. And sometimes it might be, I don't know. Then sit with it for a while. Start to ask yourself questions. Think back on these. All right. Because I think that once we start to get through that and you work through that, it makes it easier to kind of be able to counter the things that are not grounded in truth with truth. All right. All right. So a lot of today was asking questions to stimulate self-reflection. That was a lot of the point is I want you to start thinking about what you're thinking about, right? Choices are made with thought, whether they be conscious or subconscious. So let's figure out what they are so that they can start to align with what we want, which is faithful stewardship. All right. When our mindset aligns with truth, our actions begin to change. And when those actions are supported by community and accountability, those changes begin to last, right? We want to make sure that our mindset aligns with truth and is rooted in our identity as being a daughter of the King, all right? And then when our actions become supported by accountability and community, all right, when they come around us and help kind of point back to that truth, that's when we see changes last over time, all right? Our ultimate goal is not perfection. We're looking for freedom, right? We're looking for freedom from shame, from obsession, from neglect, and to care for the body, freedom to care for the body that God's entrusted you, all right? Because stewardship is not about controlling the body. It's about ordering our love rightly. We steward the body that God gave us with clarity, discipline, and gratitude so that we can live, work, serve, and love faithfully for the glory of God. Hey, and welcome to part 5. This is the final part of this course, and I'm excited because today we're going to be talking, and I'm going to be finishing up by talking about what I call the extras. So we've talked about nutrition, we've talked about training, but there's another grouping of things that are called like the extra inputs I'll talk about that actually impact your health on a day-to-day basis. And those are the ones I want to address because I think it's important to have some awareness about them. Typically when I meet with people and I talk with them about nutrition or training, we get to the point where I start asking questions about these additional things because they play a role in your overall health and how your body functions metabolically, how it functions physiologically as well. And so making sure that we're actually like paying attention to these things, I think is really important. So like I said, in part 1, we went over what does God actually say about our bodies. In part 2, we talked about nutrition. In part 3, we talked about training. In part 4, we talked about mindset and how are we able to get ourselves in a mental space where we can start to apply what we learned in parts 1, 2, and 3. Now, this last one, like I said, we're going to focus on these little extra inputs that don't take a ton of additional effort, in my opinion, but they do take a little bit of awareness and intentionality to make sure that these small parts that are part of our everyday life are actually like helping us to steward our bodies well. So the first thing we're going to start talking about is we're going to talk about sleep. Because I think a lot of people talk about sleep and what does that look like and how does that actually impact your overall health is something that we don't always talk about. So let's dig into it. All right. Sleep is one of the most foundational drivers of our physiology. It's super important and it's a time where our body is able to repair, reset, restore, right? And start to regulate different functions. Our body's ability to be able to get into the state that it is while we're sleeping and be able to repair is like super important. So some of the things that actually happen when we sleep. So one of them from like a repair and recovery perspective is we actually increase the amount of growth hormone that's produced. Now, from a training perspective, we like that because that's going to help us build our muscles a little bit stronger, right? But from an overall repairing situation, that is something that we want, right? We need growth hormone in order to appropriately grow based on the adaptations that our body is being stressed with, right? Not only that, but it also helps us from a metabolic perspective and helps us with fat metabolism. And so that's going to serve our body well. All right. Also, while we're asleep, our brain is able to consolidate information and also memory during that time. So from a restorative perspective from our brain, that's a really helpful time, right? It also helps with nervous system regulation. So when our nervous system, right, it's designed in a way so we have two different nervous systems, right? So we have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. All right. So our sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight. It's our body's ability to react to stressful stimulus and be able to appropriately, from a physiological position, be able to respond to that situation well. Then we have our parasympathetic, and that's known as like rest and digest. It's very calm. It's where our body's ability to be able to, like, we're not being faced with a lion or a tiger or some extreme stressful situation, but our body's able to like relax and be able to function from that perspective. So when we sleep, our body's actually able, from a nervous system perspective, to be able to reset that, which is super important, because if we're in a hyper-stimulated state, a hyper sympathetic state, that's not helpful. All right. We need our body to be able to go back and forth appropriately based on the stimulus that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. Our hormones also, when we sleep, those are able to get recalibrated for the next day. These are all good things that happen, and our body is able to utilize this resetting time to set us up well for the next day. But here's the thing. If we do not get enough sleep, there are actually negative implications for what that does for our health. And they affect us both metabolically and physiologically. And so I think they're important to be aware of. All right. So one of the things that happens is it does a lot with our hormones. So we talked about when we sleep, our hormones are able to recalibrate. So when we talk about hormones, that is our internal chemical messenger system. There are different messengers that go throughout our body, and from tissue to tissue to our brain to different parts, and basically tell our body, when I say our body speaks to us, that is a lot of what happens, right? These chemical messengers go around. They tell our body, hey, inflammation, you need to react. Hey, I'm hungry, you need to feed me. It tells us a lot of different information, all right? And so those are important. That whole system is important to get recalibrated on a day-to-day basis. But here's the thing. If we don't get enough sleep, our hunger hormone signals actually get a little messed up. What does that mean? That means that ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone, all right, it tells us that we're hungry. That actually is going to increase. And then leptin, which is the hormone that tells us that we are no longer hungry, that we are full, right? That one actually goes down. Now, that might be like, wait, why does that happen? If we think about it, that's actually a really cool design, because if you're in a position where you are not able to sleep, like a stressful, extreme situation, this is our body's natural wiring to be like, hey, look, if you weren't able to get sleep, we actually need more energy for you. So it makes sense that ghrelin, our hunger signal, is going to tell us, hey, you need to eat more because you weren't able to get sleep. So you're awake. So we need to make sure you have enough energy to be able to do what you need to do, right? And at the same time, we want to make sure that other one goes down so they're not fighting against each other, right? So this balance actually makes a lot of sense. In an everyday life situation where we are not getting enough sleep, what I'm talking about is there are going to be some seasons when adequate amount of sleep is just not going to be something that's going to be feasible, right? And so what comes to mind, first of all, is like when new moms have a baby, right? You just are not going to be able to have a lot of sleep, right? Because you're going to have to get up in the middle of the night. You got to take care of the baby. You got to feed the baby. But here's the cool thing, if we think about it, which is a cool design. So moms, after they've given birth, during that breastfeeding time, their needs are actually higher than their third trimester. So their needs are going to be highest at a time when they're actually trying to feed their baby versus when they were actually trying to grow their baby. So they need to make a sufficient amount of food to be able to sustain both their life and the food that's going to sustain this growing baby. All right. So it actually makes sense that when their sleep goes down, that they still have increases in those hunger hormones, even if they're not, especially because they're not getting enough sleep, to provide them with enough energy that they can support both their own health and the health of the baby. So that actually makes sense. Again, if we're on a day-to-day basis and the reason we're not getting enough sleep is because of work, lack of intentionality with putting ourselves to sleep, and not being intentional with rest time, that's when we see that these cues are not set up for that life, right? That's not stewarding our body well. Like I said, like those new moms, they're doing what they can. And this physiological adjustment actually serves them well in their current state. But for someone like me, if I'm staying up and I don't get enough sleep because I'm working, that is not stewarding my body well. That's actually trying to override the system. And then these negative implications of what happens is actually not going to allow my body to function in the way that it's designed, or set me up well to be able to like serve in the way, right? It's going to have a negative implication on my overall health. Some other shifts that happen when we don't get enough sleep is, from a metabolic perspective, we see that insulin sensitivity, that one's going to decrease. So our ability to be able to process carbohydrates, that one actually goes down, right? Something else that happens is we notice that hormones, like our cortisol hormone, so that's one of our stress hormones, that becomes dysregulated as well. So we see that it can become elevated and remain elevated or spike at various times. So here's the thing with cortisol. Cortisol it gets a bad rap, but we were intentionally created to have cortisol. So when it is used for its function, like then that's great. But if it's not, then obviously bad things happen. So here's the deal. Cortisol is a stress hormone. When we wake up, right, it is going to increase the most, all right, make us alert and aware in the morning. We want that. And then as the day goes on, it should be decreasing, essentially. There are various other times when we're going to see it go up. If you're in extremely stressful situations, whether it mean like mentally stressful or physically stressful, that's where we're going to see peaks in cortisol as well, all right? However, if we're in a state where we're not getting enough sleep, it can cause a continued elevation in that stress hormone. But if we think about it, so like situationally, if someone is in the military and they're not getting enough sleep, we actually want this to stay elevated. It's going to support them in this stressful situation because it's going to make them more alert. It's going to cause other physiological effects that happen with cortisol. However, again, on a day-to-day basis, we want this regular ebb and flow. We are not in an extreme situation across the world, potentially, where we're not being able to sleep because we're defending something. So because of that, we want to make sure that we actually care for our body and get enough sleep so that these hormones actually function the way that they're supposed to. They go up and they come back down. But again, if we're not getting enough sleep, it can, again, adjust these cortisol levels, which is going to affect the way that we process energy. It's going to affect our recovery. It's going to affect our fat metabolism. So our overall metabolic, negative implication on our metabolic functions within our body, which we don't want. All right. From a performance perspective and like a cognitive firing perspective, we also see negative implications of not getting enough sleep. So what do we see? So fun fact, right? So I worked in collegiate athletics as a strength and conditioning coach for a while, and for a number of years before now. And when I would work with athletes, right, one of the things that we constantly did is we always wanted, as sports science has been increasing, we want to make sure that we test athletes on what we call readiness. So that is essentially their physical, like their ability to be able to optimally perform, right? And so what did that look like? So one of the main things we would do is on a day-to-day basis, we would have them come and they'd go on we measure their vertical jump. So whether they jumped maximally and we just measure the height, or we put them on a force plate and measured how much force they were able to output. You can kind of do it in both ways, right? This depends on how much equipment you have. However, when we would do this, right, why would we look at that? Because we wanted to make sure that we were going to stress these athletes enough so that they actually had a positive, we want to stress them enough so that they would grow and adapt, but not too much that we overshot the runway, essentially, right? And so when you went and you were able to test them every single day, so I could test them every day, especially before they came and lifted, I could go and have them jump. And that would give me an idea of whether or not they were prepared physically to be able to handle what I was going to give to them from a lift perspective, or are they in the tank? Because if you're in the tank, there's a certain line where we don't want to push you more because that's not going to have positive returns on it. So we would go and jump. And I can tell you how many, I would look at the number, and if it was garbage, the first question I would say is, how much sleep did you get last night? And more times than not, they'd always be well, I have an exam, and so I only slept 2-3 hours or something like that. Or one of the male athletes would be oh, I was playing Fortnite all night or whatever, right? And I could see it from just looking at their jump. Why? Because they lacked sleep. So their strength, their coordination, their power output dramatically decreased because they weren't able to recover overnight. So that's what we see. When you don't get enough sleep, we see decreases in strength, coordination, reaction time, power output. All of these things actually start to go down. And so that was one thing we would look at with athletes. But from a day-to-day basis, we have to be aware of that as well. From a physical perspective, rest allows us to be able to function physically the way that we were designed. All right. Lack of sleep can also cause impaired decision-making. And can increase emotional reactivity. Anyone who's been around a 2-year-old knows that, right? You get too late in the day and they haven't had a nap. What happens? You start to melt down. Why? Because lack of sleep is going to cause that. Now, obviously, sleep requirements for a 2-year-old is going to look different than an adult. The same thing happens with an adult, right? There are certain times when you get tired, things start flying out of your mouth that were not what they were intended you, not what you normally would say, right? You're lacking self-control. So when we think about that, like being able to have sufficient amount of sleep is going to help us with that, right? It's going to help us actually like steward our bodies and be able to communicate better because we are not making ourselves susceptible to some of these negative implications of not getting enough sleep. All right. You cannot out train or out nutrition proper sleep. I get so many people that are like, well, can I just take a supplement? Can I just do that? Like, no, it's not going to make it better. Like sleep was designed on purpose, right? It's not a luxury. It is actually a biological requirement and a designed limitation for us. That is a boundary essentially that God gave us. Like we need to go to sleep in order to steward our bodies well. Like it was designed that way. You were not created to operate endlessly. You know, from someone who's not good at slowing down, I know that I need sleep in order to function my best because I can feel it, right? Sleep, the need for sleep is actually built into your physiology. Like we were created to actually need sleep so that we can function better afterwards. All right. So what does it look like and how much sleep do we actually need? So the recommendations from most scientific research is going to recommend that most adults need 7 to 9 hours. So there's a good range there because I know some people I talk to who know their body well, and if they get less than 8 hours, they're garbage, right? And so you start to feel that they need that 8 to 9 hours. There are other people that can function on 7, 8 hours, and that's fine. One of the things that I don't like hearing is a lot of times I'll hear people that are like, oh, well, like I'm fine functioning on 4 hours. You might be functional, like you might be able to do that, but we're talking about stewarding our bodies well. What was the way that God designed us and how do we actually faithfully live that out as we consider our bodies being a gift and a responsibility with a purpose, right? How do we glorify God best with our bodies, right? When we think about that, like it's looking at the limitations that it has and actually like following along with that so that it can function within the design. Our bodies. All right. So next we're going to talk about breathing. All right. And I know that some people immediately heard that and rolled their eyes and want to fast forward, and that's fine if you do. But the reality is breathing is something that we constantly do, but most people haven't thought about how to do it well. And it's super important and impactful for our overall health. All right. So breathing is going to affect our oxygen delivery, our carbon dioxide balance, our heart rate, our nervous system regulation, our physical performance as well, the way our body can physically do things, right? And so that is all really important. We need oxygen in order to be able to produce energy. We need that in order for long-term energy. So if you don't have it, you're going to die. We all know that, right? So it's really important to think about the way that our body actually consumes and uses oxygen to make sure, because that's going to impact our overall health, right? So when we think about it, shallow and rapid breathing and excessive mouth breathing, right? And I say excessive because some people are like, well, I casually breathe. But if you're just breathing through your mouth and not using your nose, that form of breathing can actually keep you in a more like activated or stress-oriented state. So when that happens, what happens? So our carbon dioxide levels are going to drop, which is going to affect our oxygen delivery to our different tissues. So our blood gases are super important, like I said, because we want them transported to our body so that it can be used effectively for what it's needed. And one of the primary needs that our body has for oxygen is to produce energy. All right. So you have to think about that. If we're not breathing correctly, that actually affects our overall energy among other different systems in our body. All right. So if we can get to a more slower and controlled breathing, right, that can help us with our carbon dioxide levels, our blood gas levels, and the delivery throughout our body. Nasal breathing is actually one way that we can help that as well, like more intentional with it, because when we nasal breathe, so we breathe in through our nose, right, that's going to help to increase our nitric oxide production. And why that's important is it's a vasodilator. It increases the size of our blood vessels, which allows for more blood flow throughout our body and just helps with oxygen delivery and utilization throughout our bodies, which means, again, more energy. So that is one thing that we need to keep in mind, all right, is like being able to do that. And typically, if you're able to breathe through your nose and do that nasal breathing, it's also going to help to calm you down, all right? So we talked about earlier our different nervous systems. And so we have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic. A lot of times there's so much going on in society. One of the biggest things that is apparent now is really the ability for us as a hyperstimulated society to help engage our parasympathetic nervous system. So that means to help calm ourselves down. So nasal breathing is one way to help engage that, like activate that parasympathetic nervous system and calm ourselves down. Like anyone's heard someone who's like getting all worked up, what's the first recommendation most people say? Take a deep breath. Why? When we take a deep breath, it can actually help change our nervous, activate that parasympathetic, calm us down, help us get appropriate, like more blood gas flow throughout our body, which can help with a lot of different things, including our energy and our nervous system regulation. All right. So that is important for our nervous system, but also when we think about exercise. So there is some of our endurance is impacted a little bit by our carbon dioxide levels and our ability to be able to tolerate those levels when they increase. So that's a little bit of it. But also, all right, breathing is going to directly impact your core. All right. And so most of the time when people say core, they're just thinking about like your abs, your superficial abs. That's not all what I'm talking about, right? So your diaphragm, which is a muscle that essentially when it engages, it goes down and allows for your thoracic cavity, so the cavity where your lungs are, to be able to expand. So when you control that well, it allows for your lungs to expand so that you can breathe in more oxygen. All right. And so when we learn to control our breathing and control our diaphragm, it's really helpful because that is helpful for breathing, right? So one of the ways we do it is like belly breathing. And so oftentimes I'll tell people, put your hands, one hand on your belly and one hand on your chest. Because normally when I say take a deep breath, what happens? Everyone goes, all right, your lungs didn't expand very much. We want to make sure that your diaphragm goes down. So when that happens, when you belly breathe, when you breathe in through your stomach, it allows for your lungs, which are like more towards the back of you, to be able to expand out. Because you're going down here, it expands this cavity and allows your lungs to increase. So a lot of times that's one simple thing I'll teach people. All right, let's try to learn about breathing through your hand. Like I said, put one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly, and then see if you can use that tactile sense to be able to think about where you need that breath going. And that can help a little bit. So it helps you just engage that, but your diaphragm also helps with core stabilization. So if we can start to engage that a little bit more, it's going to help with posture. It's going to help with stability. It's going to help with overall movement. All right. Because it's going to allow us to engage the muscles that support our spine and move more effectively. All right. So that is super important. Breathing is foundational, like breath is foundational. If we remember back to Genesis, we talked about it, is that God actually breathed life into Adam, right? He breathed life. We actually need breath to come in to be able to create energy for us to be able to live the way that our body was designed. And so I think it's important that we actually start to think about that. So what are some of the things we can start to do to actually pay attention a little bit to our breathing? One thing is going to be work on nasal breathing. So like I said earlier, just think about it. Think about when you're calm, like when you're sitting down, like, can you breathe in and out through your nose and out breathing through your mouth? And if you're like, I'm struggling with that, one of the other things is try to put your tongue on the roof of your mouth. That can help engage that a little bit more and help to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. Once you start getting good at being able to think about that and be able to breathe through your nose, I normally recommend trying to do a short walk outside. So when you're walking, right, can you continue to control your breathing despite the fact that you're moving and your heart rate may be going up a little bit? All right. Again, it helps us from like a parasympathetic, a nervous system regulation state, which is going to help, again, our body, also help that oxygen flow throughout our body. Another thing I'll say is I normally recommend try box breathing. So here's why. And here's the reason why I actually have this in here. So yes, we talked a little bit about how breathing impacts training from like a core stability perspective. And also if we're not breathing effectively or breathing well while we are lifting weights, that's going to put you susceptible for honestly being able to pass out. Because as you increase the amount of stress that your body is under, if you're not thinking about being able to control deeper breaths and they get shallow and rapid while you're in a stressful state, which is like lifting weights or working out in general is an intentional stressful state for your body that can actually, like, you might become deficient. It might throw off your blood gases, which can allow you to potentially pass out. All right. So if you're someone who's like, I start to lift weights and I get really lightheaded, this is going to be super important for you to really focus on that, to be able to help you be able to train a little bit more intentionally so that you can actually like stress that adaptation and begin to grow from a strength perspective and a cardiovascular perspective to be able to support your body. Another thing I will say is that breathing can greatly impact your nutrition as well. And here's why. So when at the last school I was at, there was one athlete that was on one of the teams that I did strength conditioning for, but I also saw her from a sport nutrition perspective. And one of the things that she was really struggling with was on game days, she really struggled to eat and she would get super nauseous, couldn't keep down food. So as we talked through this whole situation, tried a bunch of different things, it became really clear to me that the issue was not actually the food. It was the anxiety related to game day. And so that's one of the ways that we can see that nutrition can really, if our breathing, so if our nervous system is unregulated, it can affect our overall nutrition or ability to be able to appropriately consume food that's going to support our bodies. So what I would do is I would take her team before they went to warm up, because I knew she wasn't the only one who was having this issue. We went into a quiet, calm room. We would turn off the lights and the team would lay down on the ground and I'd walk them through box breathing. All right. So doing this, what you do is we laid down on the ground. Like I said, I had them put one hand on their belly, one hand on their chest so that they were really being intentional with that belly breathing. And so we would inhale. So for box breathing, we started with 4 seconds. I put ranges here. As you get more comfortable, you can push it a little bit, but typically I start with 4 seconds. So what you do is you're going to visualize a box. So you're going to breathe. So you're going to inhale for 4 seconds going up the box. You're going to hold that breath in for 4 seconds going across. You're going to exhale for 4 seconds, and then you hold that out for 4 seconds. All right. That is box breathing. So we were learning to control our breath. I typically would have them do it 2 times in a row, and then we would go back. All right. So it doesn't take very much time, but the simple act of being able to do that allowed for the engagement of that parasympathetic nervous system. And we were able to start, and the team was able to start tolerating food better before they were able to play, which allowed them to have more energy, last throughout the entire match as well. And so this is one way. If our breathing is off, it can affect our training. It can affect our ability to be able to consume food. Now, yes, that was an athlete, but it can affect us on a day-to-day basis, even if you're not an athlete. So it's something that I really encourage people to start thinking about how their body, about how they're breathing so they can best serve their body. All right. So the last thing we're going to talk about that I think is an important input is sunlight. So sunlight and the value of going outside. All right. It is so important to go outside every single day. It is not food. It is not training, but it's super important and it serves your body well, right? So there are a couple of reasons why. One, most people know vitamin D. So that's an easy one to start off with, is that we can get nutrients through our skin. So vitamin D production, obviously we've all heard of this, is that sunlight is going to expose us to different types of rays, which is going to allow our skin to be able to produce vitamin D, which plays a role in so many different things, right? Our immune system, it affects our bones, our muscles, our hormone regulation as well. So vitamin D does act like a hormone, all right, but it has the effect of being able to impact our immune system and can help play a role in our inflammatory process as well, all right? So getting enough vitamin D is important. And we'll talk about this in recommendations. You don't have to be outside for a ton of time, but midday for about 10 to 30 minutes is going to be really helpful to be able to make sure that we're getting in some vitamin D through that. So yes, you can get vitamin D through food as well, but being able to expose yourself and get some through your skin is going to be super important to help meet your needs. All right. Some of the other impacts that sunlight can do. So sunlight is actually good for your cardiovascular system. Why? Because some of the UV exposure, so some of the rays we get from the sun, actually stimulate the release of nitric oxide in your skin. So we talked about nitric oxide before, and that is a vasodilator. It increases your blood vessel width, so allows for more blood flow to go about your body, right? So that's great because it can decrease blood pressure and also increase that oxygen delivery throughout our system. Again, another positive thing that we want. All right. Then another one is our mood and our mental health can be positively impacted by just going outside in the sunlight. I think this one is pretty like common sense. We don't always think about it, but everyone knows it's like dreary and gross in January, and then all of a sudden it's sunny. Everyone's outside. Everyone's excited. Why? Because the sunlight actually has an impact on us. So sunlight exposure is associated with increased serotonin activity. So we know that that can increase our mood, support our emotional stability, and also reduce the risk of depressive symptoms. All right. So going outside can actually help our body produce natural, so like serotonin, right? A natural thing that gets produced within our body to help us get excited, right? So that is great. Like also, if you think about that, what a cool design for God to be like, hey, if you just go outside and get some sun, which I created, it's going to like help make you like excited about it. Like, that's so cool, right? I don't know. Some of those things I like when I think about it, I'm like, how did you think about designing this? Like the design of this world is just wild. And it's so cool how it's all interconnected. Also, right? So our circadian rhythm is another thing I'll talk about when it comes to sunlight. So there are different things. So light in general, right, is going to play a major role in our circadian rhythm, right? This everyday rhythm that like our wake and sleep cycle that we have. So it's going to affect our sleep, our hormones, our energy, our appetite, our just like daily metabolic processes, like the daily metabolic functions, right? So if we're able to get morning light, so like in the morning, it helps to stimulate wakefulness in our body, right? So like as our brain, so our retina is going to take it, sends a signal to our brain. So our eyes tell our brain, right? And it helps create wakefulness. It helps support our healthy cortisol rhythm. We talked about cortisol before. Like when we're exposed to sunlight early, it helps with that rise in the morning, which we want. And then it'll help it start to like decrease throughout the day, right? It helps regulate our melatonin. So melatonin we want to be released later because that's going to help us sleep. All right. And it's going to just set you up better for sleep. So if we're more awake in the morning, it helps us in that daily rhythm, right? One of the things we have to be aware of, and like this is something I have to be super intentional about, especially because now we have screens and we have electricity, which are great tools. But again, we have to be intentional with how we're using them and how they affect us, is that a lot of artificial light at night can be negatively impactful on our overall health. How? It's going to suppress melatonin release, right? And melatonin we want because that's going to help us go to sleep. It can it can cause a delay in the onset of sleep as well and just disrupt that overall rhythm. So we want to make sure that as it's getting closer to night, we're decreasing that because we learned at the beginning the importance of sleep. And if we're doing things that are going to adjust those, right, we want to make sure that we're aware of that so that we can, again, the goal is to steward our bodies well. So awareness is key to be able to live that way, right? To be able to make adjustments so that we can best serve in the way that we were called to serve. All right. So what are the recommendations when it comes to it? So I will say this. I recommend that everybody get outside every day. Why? It's going to help from a metabolic perspective. It's going to help from a mood perspective. It can help with potentially from an immune perspective. All of these different things. It helps our body like function in the way that it was intended to function, right? So from a light perspective, if we can get out early in the morning, like within 60 minutes of waking up, that's great because it's going to give us that exposure, that light exposure that we want. If you can't get outside, at least opening your blinds so that you're getting that sun exposure is helpful. But then I also recommend being able to go out midday. If we can go out midday for 10 to 30 minutes, get exposure to that sunlight. Now, I recognize that like some days are overcast. Okay, still being outside, you can still get rays through the clouds. If we can go outside, there's still a benefit of being able to get exposed to that outside light. So 10 to 30 minutes is best for, in the middle of the day, is best for vitamin D exposure. All right, so let's kind of wrap this up. All right, so as we kind of look back on this course, these are the different parts. And we talked about this at the beginning. And I hope that it all fits together on how, like, what does God think about our bodies? How do we feed it? How do we train it? How do we get our mind in a place where we can apply all of those things together? And then what are the other things that are impacting our health on a day-to-day basis? And can we be intentional with those? So we're not just shaped by what we eat and how you train, but we're also affected by how we sleep, how we breathe, whether or not we go outside and have exposure to outside sunlight and as well. All right. Stewardship is not just about doing things right occasionally. It's all about paying attention, being intentional with our everyday lives, right? So some of the things to think about, right, especially after today, is as we're considering this as a whole. So, or like this specific one, I want us to be thinking about like, did I sleep enough last night? How am I at breathing? Have I ever thought about that? Like, if I try to train, do I get really out of breath? Do I get lightheaded? Like, these are some things to start to consider. Is my nervous system all out of whack during the day? Because some of those things might be impacted by our breathing. And then, did I go outside today? I think these simple questions are good ways to kind of start thinking about the other inputs that are potentially going to affect our overall health. So I ask these questions not as a way to judge, right? They're all as a way to build awareness, because I think it's really important to build awareness of how we're living our day-to-day life, being aware of the inputs that are impacting our overall health and the way that our body functions, all right? Because in the end, as a reminder, we're seeking faithful stewardship. And faithful stewardship is seeing our body as both a gift and a responsibility with a purpose. So I want you to go out and faithfully live that purpose.